The invasion fleet did not move like a triumphant armada. It crept forward under cloud and uncertainty. By June 1944, the Allied command had assembled the largest amphibious assault force in recorded warfare. Over 150,000 soldiers would land in a single day along roughly 50 miles of Normandy coastline. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft crossed the English Channel. Battleships displacing over 30,000 tons, fired shells weighing nearly 2,000 pounds each. Supply planners calculated the first 24 hours alone would require thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations to keep the beachhead alive. On paper, the invasion looked overwhelming. In practice, its survival depended on minutes, tides, and navigation errors measured in yards. German defenses stretched along the Atlantic Wall, bunkers built from reinforced concrete several feet thick, anti-tank guns hidden in casemates, and minefields seeded with thousands of explosive charges. Beach obstacles were designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft at low tide. Artillery batteries positioned inland fired shells weighing over 20 pounds toward any vessel drifting within range. German divisions defending Normandy did not equal Allied numbers overall, but their defensive positions multiplied the lethality of every gun. Weather nearly canceled everything. Storm systems rolling across the channel generated waves high enough to swamp landing craft carrying infantry. Pilots flying transport aircraft struggled to maintain formation in darkness and cloud. If the weather window closed, the invasion would delay weeks, exposing the entire armada to German reconnaissance. The decision to launch on June 6th required committing thousands of ships and aircraft into seas that already churned violently. Inside a landing craft heading toward Omaha Beach, soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, each carrying equipment weighing over 60 pounds. Engines rattled beneath thin steel hulls. Waves slammed against the bow ramp. Many men vomited before reaching shore. Machine gun rounds striking water nearby snapped like whips. When the ramp dropped, infantry stepped into surf often waist-deep, struggling to keep rifles above water. At Omaha, German defensive fire collided with American units, landing in sectors misaligned by currents and navigation errors. Some assault companies lost more than half their men within minutes. Casualty rates during the first waves climbed towards 60% in certain sections of the beach. Machine gun nests, positioned in elevated bunkers, fired continuously into narrow landing zones. Tanks meant to provide early fire support sank when rough seas flooded their flotation screens. The invasion timetable began to erode immediately. Naval bombardment intended to suppress German guns often overshot or ended before infantry reached the shore. Engineers attempting to clear obstacles were cut down before detonating charges. Landing craft collided in chaotic surf. Officers struggled to locate their units amid smoke and exploding artillery shells. The carefully planned assault sequence fractured into scattered groups fighting independently. I once studied the after-action reports from American battalions at Omaha, alongside German defensive logs preserved after the war. What struck me was how close the situation drifted toward collapse during the first hours. Several commanders reported considering evacuation because casualties had shredded unit cohesion, and progress inland measured only a few dozen yards. Yet small groups of soldiers gradually infiltrated through bluffs and ravines, attacking bunker positions from the flank. Those improvised movements recalibrated the battle minute by minute. Airborne operations earlier that night had already scattered paratroopers across Normandy. Some units landed miles from their objectives. Equipment bundles containing heavy weapons dropped into flooded fields. Yet those scattered soldiers still sabotaged bridges, ambushed German patrols, and disrupted communications. Their presence fractured German response times, even when their drop zones had drifted. Meanwhile, offshore battleships and cruisers adjusted firing coordinates. Naval guns continued launching shells weighing hundreds of pounds toward defensive positions overlooking the beaches. The concussion alone shook concrete bunkers. When forward observers managed to transmit coordinates, concentrated fire suppressed German strongpoints that had dominated the shoreline. German command response also stalled under uncertainty. Hitler retained direct control over several armored divisions positioned to counterattack an invasion. Authorization to deploy them required approval that arrived slowly. Conflicting intelligence suggested the Normandy landings might be a diversion for a larger assault near Pas de Calais. Hours passed before decisive movement orders circulated. Those hours mattered. By midday, small Allied units had climbed the bluffs above Omaha, and begun attacking defensive positions from behind. Engineers cleared narrow paths through minefields. Reinforcements landed continuously. Each arriving wave carried ammunition crates weighing dozens of pounds, additional rifles, and radios capable of restoring coordination. What began as fragmented survival hardened into a foothold. The cost was severe. Thousands of Allied soldiers were killed or wounded on June 6th alone. Entire companies were reduced to fractions of their original strength before noon. Equipment losses included dozens of tanks destroyed or submerged. Yet the beachhead did not fracture, it expanded. Strategically, the invasion succeeded because multiple pressures converged simultaneously. Naval firepower suppressed defenses long enough for infantry to gain ground. Air superiority limited German reconnaissance and movement. Airborne units disrupted communication lines inland. And perhaps most importantly, German counterattacks did not arrive quickly enough to push the attackers back into the sea. But survival on that morning hinged on fragile margins. A delayed naval bombardment, slightly stronger waves, faster German armored deployment. Any one of those variables could have altered the trajectory of the day. Instead, Allied persistence converted initial chaos into operational foothold. Imagine standing on the deck of a landing craft just before the ramp drops. Water hammering the hull, machine gun fire cracking overhead. Somewhere beyond the smoke lies a strip of sand that must be seized, or the entire operation collapses. Maps drawn weeks earlier dissolve under noise and confusion. Only movement remains. And if you are listening to this now, perhaps letting the quiet settle around you at night, picture that coastline after the guns finally slow. Smoke drifts over wrecked landing craft. The tide moves in and out against steel obstacles planted in sand. Soldiers lie exhausted against the bluffs they fought to climb. The invasion survived the morning. This is the entire history of why D-Day almost failed. The untold story. Chapter 1. The Letter in the Left Pocket. The 5th of June, 1944. Somewhere on the grounds of Southwick House, a requisitioned country estate roughly 12 kilometers north of Portsmouth, a general sits alone. The building itself had been converted into a command headquarters, maps covering the walls, telephones ringing at all hours, officers moving in and out with the particular tense efficiency of people who know that what they are preparing for cannot be undone once it begins. But in this moment, late in the evening, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force is not studying a map. He's writing. Not orders, not a communiqué, a letter in which he acknowledges, in his own handwriting, that he has already failed. The document itself is extraordinary, and almost no one talks about it. It's held today at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, and when you look at the original, and I mean really look at it, not a reproduction in a glossy anniversary book, the first thing you notice is the date at the top. It reads 5 July 44, the 5th of July 1944. Except Eisenhower didn't write it in July. He wrote it the night before the largest amphibious operation in human history, the 5th of June. He was writing under such sustained psychological pressure that he couldn't correctly record the month he was actually living through. He transposed June to July. That's not a clerical error. That's a human being operating right at the edge of his own cognitive capacity. And the misdating has been quietly sitting in that archive ever since, telling us more about the real cost of command than any official portrait ever could. The text of the note is short. Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. That's essentially it. No elaborate justification, no laundry list of contributing factors, just a man taking the weight of a potential catastrophe onto his own shoulders, in advance, before any catastrophe had occurred. The official history of Operation Overlord describes the mood at SHAEF headquarters as confident and determined. This note suggests something more complicated. What I find fascinating, and I've spent time trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that night, is what Eisenhower did after writing the note. According to the account of his naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, whose memoir, My 3 Years with Eisenhower, was published in 1946, Eisenhower folded the paper and put it away. He didn't discuss it with his staff. He went, instead, to Greenham Common Airfield, where soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division were in the final stages of loading onto their transport aircraft. He walked among them quietly. He asked them where they were from. He shook hands. Butcher, who observed this visit, wrote that Eisenhower's expression was that of a man carrying something he couldn't set down. When the transports taxied away and lifted into the darkening sky, Eisenhower watched until they disappeared, then returned to his car without speaking. To understand why the note existed at all, you need to understand the scale of what was being committed to the water that night. The Allied invasion fleet for Operation Overlord comprised more than 5,000 ships and landing craft. More than 150,000 troops were scheduled to land on 5 beaches, along a roughly 80-kilometer stretch of the Normandy coast on the 6th of June. The planning had been ongoing since 1943. The training had been continuous. And yet the night before it began, the man responsible for all of it, a general who had commanded operations in North Africa and Sicily, privately rated the possibility of failure as real enough to write a public statement accepting responsibility for it. That's not excessive caution. That's honest, strategic assessment. There's an important distinction that the triumphalist D-Day narrative consistently blurs, and it's worth being precise about it here at the outset. Eisenhower did not write this note because he was overwhelmed or uncertain of his own judgment. He wrote it because he understood, with professional clarity, that the operation he had approved contained multiple potential failure points that no amount of planning could fully eliminate. The weather decision alone, which we'll examine in detail later, had been made on a meteorological forecast that the chief forecaster himself privately considered marginal at best. The tank support for Omaha Beach was being launched into sea conditions that exceeded the equipment's rated operational envelope. The Allied bombing of the beach fortifications was being conducted by strategic heavy bombers at altitudes that made precision essentially impossible. Eisenhower knew all of this. The note is the written record of a man who knew. When I cross-reference the note's text with the planning documents from the weeks preceding D-Day, the 5th Corps assault plans, the 9th Troop Carrier Command air operations orders, the naval bombardment schedules, I'm struck again and again by how many individual elements of the operation carried what modern risk analysts would call single point of failure characteristics. If the DD tanks didn't arrive on Omaha, the first wave had no armor. If the airborne Pathfinder beacons didn't work, 13,000 paratroopers would be scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula without coordination. If the weather window closed early, the landing craft would be operating in conditions that made the cross-channel transit genuinely dangerous. Every one of these contingencies materialized on the 6th of June, and yet the operation succeeded. That fact, that all these things failed and the landing survived, is what this documentary is about. The note was crumpled. That detail matters, and it's documented. After the confirmation arrived on the 6th of June that the landings were holding, tenuously, at terrible cost at Omaha, but holding, Eisenhower took the note from wherever he had kept it, crumpled it, and threw it away. He didn't file it. He didn't burn it. He crumpled it and dropped it into what Butcher describes as a wastepaper basket. Butcher retrieved it. He apparently understood, even in the immediate aftermath of the landing's initial success, that a crumpled draft of an unsent failure statement was a primary historical document of the First Order. He kept it. It eventually made its way to the family, then to the archive, then to the library case in Abilene where it sits today. Fold crease visible, the misdated month at the top, a fingerprint in the upper right corner that has never been identified. The logistical stakes embedded in that note were not abstract. The Allied supply plan for the Normandy campaign assumed a throughput of roughly 26,000 tons of materiel per day across all beaches once the operation was established. A failed landing, or even a landing so badly disrupted that it required withdrawal and replanning, would have pushed the next viable tidal and lunar window for a major assault back to approximately the 18th to 20th of June. And as it happened, the 19th to 22nd of June 1944 saw one of the most severe channel storms in 4 decades strike the Normandy coast, destroying the American Mulberry Artificial Harbor at Saint-Laurent completely and badly damaging its British counterpart at Arromanches. An invasion attempting to land into that storm would not have had a tenuously held beachhead. It would have had a catastrophe. The window Eisenhower forced open on the 6th of June was, retrospectively, the only window available. He couldn't have known that on the 5th. He committed anyway. After Butcher retrieved the note, after the landing had held and the follow-on forces were ashore, after the immediate crisis had passed, Eisenhower never publicly acknowledged its existence. His memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, presents the decision to go on the 6th of June in a tone of reasoned confidence. There's no mention of a failure draft. There's no mention of what he was carrying when he walked among the paratroopers at Greenham Common. The memoir is a great book and a carefully constructed one, and it tells the story of a victorious commander. The crumpled note in the archive in Abilene tells the story of the hours before he knew he would be one. The fingerprint in the upper right corner, Butcher's perhaps, smoothing it flat before filing it, has never been tested, never identified. Some margins stay unread. The note itself, though, the ink on the yellow paper, the transposed month, the fold crease down the middle, that's as clear a record as any archive holds of what D-Day actually cost before the first soldier set foot on the sand. Chapter 2. Rommel's Unfinished Wall. The 19th of February, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Army Group B commander, is somewhere on the Normandy coastline, probably standing on wet sand in a gray morning light, looking at the water, calculating. He had been touring the Atlantic wall defenses since January, walking beaches, probing fortifications, pulling on steel obstacles to test their installation depth, asking engineers uncomfortable questions about completion schedules. The Atlantic Wall was the name given to the fortification system that stretched from Norway to the Franco-Spanish border, roughly 3,200 kilometers of coastline that the German military had been constructing since 1942. Rommel had been given command of its most critical sector, and what he found when he arrived was not reassuring. The inspection report from that February visit survives, reproduced in part in Basil Little Hart's edited collection, The Rommel Papers, published in 1953. It is a document of professional anxiety, expressed through engineering specifics. Rommel's analysis of what it would take to defeat an Allied amphibious landing was, in retrospect, strategically sound. He believed the invasion could only be stopped at the waterline, in the first few hours, before a beachhead could be consolidated. Once the Allies were ashore and organized, he argued, the material weight of American and British production would be impossible to dislodge. His proposed solution was a beach defense of sufficient density that no assault wave could survive long enough to establish itself. Multiple rows of obstacles below the high water line, layered minefields, interlocking fields of fire from hardened positions. The marginal note in that February report, in what Liddell Hart's editorial notes describe as a different ink from the typescript, reads something to the effect of, "The work proceeds as if we have years, we have weeks." That annotation, added apparently on a later reading of his own inspection report, is one of the more revealing pieces of marginalia in the entire D-Day archive. He was watching himself lose a race he couldn't stop running. What Rommel had specified for the Normandy beaches was 6 rows of obstacles between the low water mark and the high water mark. 6 distinct rows, each with different design characteristics to engage landing craft and infantry at different stages of a tidal approach. The reality he found was closer to 3. The Warfare History Network's account of the Atlantic Wall construction, drawing on engineering records and post-war surveys, notes that by early June 1944, roughly 500 permanent structures had been built in the Normandy sector, a genuinely formidable number in isolation, but that the obstacle density fell significantly short of Rommel's specified requirement. The Liberation Route Europe Archaeological Survey of the Normandy coastline puts the figure at approximately 200,000 obstacles in place before June of that year, along with roughly 2 million mines. That sounds enormous. Against Rommel's stated requirement, it was incomplete. The construction shortfall wasn't the result of laziness or incompetence among the engineering units. It was the result of a competition for strategic resources across a theater of war fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Atlantic Wall consumed, over its 2-year construction program, approximately 17.3 million cubic meters of concrete, a figure so large it strained Germany's cement production capacity to the point where, by early 1944, some Luftwaffe airfield repair projects on the Eastern Front were experiencing material delays. The wall was absorbing resources that other parts of the military apparatus needed, and it was still not being completed at the pace Rommel required. When I work through the construction logistics, the cement allocations, the labor deployment records, the engineering battalion assignments, what I find is a system that was being asked to do 2 contradictory things simultaneously. fortify 3,000 kilometers of coastline, and maintain operational capability everywhere else. It couldn't fully do both. The obstacle system itself, where it had been installed, was designed with a precision that's easy to overlook when you're looking at photographs of tangled steel on a beach. Rommel understood tidal mechanics intimately. The Element C obstacles, large steel gates sometimes called Belgian gates, salvaged from pre-war anti-tank barriers, were positioned at specific water depths to engage landing craft during the half-tide approach, when the craft would be committed to their run, but the obstacles would not yet be submerged. The wooden ramp obstacles, topped with Teller mines or anti-tank shells rigged as contact explosives, were angled to direct the hulls of landing craft upward and onto the detonating charge. The steel tetrahedra and hedgehogs were placed to puncture hulls or foul propellers. Each obstacle type occupied a specific tidal zone, creating an interlocking engagement envelope that would theoretically destroy or disable craft across the full width of an assault approach. Where it existed at full density, it was genuinely dangerous. Where it didn't exist, the gaps were exactly that. The bocage terrain behind the beaches also complicated Rommel's inland defensive preparation. The hedgerow country of Normandy, ancient earthen field boundaries topped with dense vegetation, some of them 2 meters high and a meter thick, created natural defensive compartments that infantry could hold with small numbers against larger attacking forces. Rommel understood this and incorporated it into his defense in-depth planning. But his primary argument, the one he pressed in multiple conferences with Hitler and the OKW staff through the spring of 1944, was that none of the inland terrain advantages would matter if the Allies were allowed to consolidate a beachhead. His doctrine was beach defeat or no defeat. He needed the wall to be finished. It wasn't. What strikes me most forcefully when I look at the timeline of Rommel's inspections against the engineering completion records is the compression of the schedule. Rommel took command of Army Group B in January 1944. The invasion came in June. He had roughly 5 months to accelerate a construction program that had been running at its existing pace for 2 years. In that 5 months, the work pace did increase substantially. More obstacles were placed in those 5 months than in the preceding year, but not enough. The gap between what he needed and what was installed by June 6th was precisely the gap through which the invasion's survival threaded. 3 rows of obstacles instead of 6 meant that Allied combat engineers, arriving under fire with 30 minutes between the first wave and the rising tide, had a margin, barely, to blow clearance lanes. 6 rows would have meant no margin at all. The concrete that was poured, though, that part of the wall deserves its own examination, because the gun emplacements and observation bunkers that were completed were formidable in ways that the Allied fire plan consistently underestimated. The standard Regelbau design for a machine gun casemate used approximately 300 cubic meters of reinforced concrete, with walls up to 2 meters thick and a forward aperture angled to provide enfilading fire along the beach rather than perpendicular to it. This design feature, the enfilading angle, is critical, and we'll return to it in detail when we discuss Omaha. For now, the key point is that a structure containing that much concrete could absorb naval gunfire, survive near-miss bombs, and continue functioning. The wall's completed portions weren't soft. They were designed by engineers who understood exactly what they needed to resist. By the 4th of June, 1944, 2 days before the landing, only 3 of the 6 obstacle rows Rommel had specified were in place along most of the Normandy beaches. In the fields behind the beaches, approximately 500,000 poles had been embedded in open ground to impale gliders and disable airborne landings, what the Allies called Rommel's asparagus. The flooding of the Meurthe and Douve river valleys, which Rommel had ordered as a defensive measure to turn the flat, low-lying ground into an infantry obstacle, was substantially complete. 2 million mines were in the ground, but the beach obstacle belt, the first, most critical layer of the defensive system, was unfinished, and the concrete program, the permanent gun positions and observation posts, numbered approximately 500 structures in the Normandy sector against a coastline of 80 kilometers. That's 1 structure per 160 meters of beach. Against the concentration of firepower and men the Allies were bringing across the channel, the math was close. Closer than the Atlantic Wall's formidable reputation suggests. The Warfare History Network article on Atlantic Wall construction, drawing on German engineering records, makes a point that I think deserves to be stated plainly. At the beginning of June, only 3 of the 6 rows of obstacles Rommel wanted had been placed along the Normandy beaches. This lack was due in part to the difficulty of obtaining sufficient quantities of materials. That sentence contains, in compressed form, the whole story of why the wall wasn't what Rommel needed it to be. Not ideology, not strategy, not generalship. Materials. Germany was running short of the physical stuff of construction. The steel, the concrete, the timber, the mines. The most ambitious fixed fortification program in European history was failing not because of a flawed concept, but because the industrial capacity that fed it was being drained from multiple directions, simultaneously. Rommel had drawn the right defensive map. He just didn't have enough pencil to finish it. And on the 6th of June, 1944, that unfinished margin made all the difference. Chapter 3. The Army That Never Existed. Somewhere in the English countryside, in the early months of 1944, a radio operator is sitting in front of a transmitter sending messages. The messages describe unit movements, logistics requests, command rotations, staff conferences, fuel allocations, training schedules. They describe, in the exhaustive bureaucratic language of military administration, the daily functioning of a large and capable army group. The radio traffic is consistent, plausible, and operationally detailed. German signals intelligence analysts in France and at OKW are intercepting and logging it. They're building a picture of Allied force dispositions in southeast England that is, to all appearances, solid and reliable. The army described in those transmissions, the 1st United States Army Group, designated FUSAG, nominally commanded by General George Patton, does not exist. Not one soldier, not one tank, not one supply depot. It is radio traffic generated by trained operators, structured to replicate the signal's signature of a genuine 150,000-man formation. And it is working. Operation Fortitude was the name given to the Allied deception campaign designed to convince the German military that the main invasion force would land at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. It was part of a broader deception program called Operation Bodyguard, and within Fortitude there were 2 sub-operations. Fortitude North, which used fake signals traffic to suggest a threat to Norway, and Fortitude South, which created FUSAG. The standard account of Fortitude presents it as a brilliant piece of Allied strategic deception that kept German panzer reserves away from the beaches on June 6th. That account isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. The more important and less told story is what Fortitude did after the 6th of June, the weeks when the deception had to survive its most critical test, when the invasion had already happened, and the Germans had to decide whether Normandy was the main event or the opening act. The architecture of the deception required simultaneous operations on multiple levels. At the physical level, there were dummy landing craft, constructed from canvas and scaffolding, moored in ports along the Thames estuary and the Kent coast, visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. There were fake fuel dumps, fake vehicle parks, fake airfield construction. At the signals level, the FUSAG radio traffic network was broadcasting at the volume and variety of a genuine army headquarters, including the administratively mundane traffic, medical supply requisitions, leave rosters, vehicle maintenance returns that a real formation's rear echelon would generate. German traffic analysts assessed signals not just for content, but for pattern. The ratio of operational to administrative traffic, the rhythm of transmission times, the specific call signs and procedural formats that characterized British and American military communications. The Fortitude operators had to replicate all of these patterns convincingly, which required detailed knowledge of how a real army headquarters actually sounded on the air. It was, in effect, an extremely well-researched performance. The human element of Fortitude centered on a network of double agents run by the XX Committee, the 20 Committee, named for the double-cross symbol, staffed by MI5 officers who managed German Abwehr agents who had been caught and turned. The most important of these was a Spanish man who went by the codename Garbo, Juan Pujol Garcia in the declassified files. Garbo had originally approached British intelligence on his own initiative before the war, motivated by a profound personal opposition to fascism, and had been initially rejected. He then went to the German Abwehr in Madrid and offered his services as a spy, was accepted, and began sending them fabricated intelligence reports about Britain, reports based entirely on publicly available sources and his own inventive imagination, before the British eventually realized what he was doing and brought him inside the system. By 1944, he had constructed, in his correspondence with his German handlers, a fictional network of 27 subagents spread across Britain, each with a distinct personality, background, and access profile. They existed entirely in his letters. The Germans paid him for their maintenance and trusted their reports. What the FUSAG deception achieved at the strategic level can be measured in German order of battle estimates. Allied military intelligence assessed, based on intercept and analysis of German signals traffic, that German intelligence estimated the Allied force in Britain at approximately 79 divisions. The actual number was closer to 52. The gap, roughly 27 phantom divisions, represented the notional strength of FUSAG and associated fictional formations. This inflation directly shaped Wehrmacht deployment planning in France. Divisions were kept north of the Seine, in the Pas-de-Calais sector, waiting for an attack from a phantom army that existed only in radio logs and forged agent reports. The Army Press Online Journal's 2020 analysis of Operation Fortitude South, drawing on declassified planning files, confirms that the false information from double agents led to the Nazi regime's hesitation to commit its reserves and the decision to pull the German 15th Army back to Pas-de-Calais. That's a consequence of extraordinary strategic scale, achieved through radio operators, canvas dummies, and one man's fictional correspondence. The question that serious historians argue about, and it's a genuine argument, not a settled matter, is whether the post-landing phase of Fortitude was more decisive than the pre-landing phase. Roger Hesketh, who ran significant portions of the Fortitude operation and wrote its official internal history, classified until 1999, argued that the critical period was the weeks after the 6th of June, when Garbeau's reports had to convince the German High Command that Normandy was a feint, and the real blow was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. The logic was demanding. By June 9th, Allied troops were clearly ashore in Normandy in significant numbers. Maintaining the fiction that this was a diversion required Garbeau to send his most important and most audacious message of the entire war. A cable to his Abwehr handler insisting that Normandy was indeed the secondary operation, and that the 1st United States Army Group under Patton remained poised for the primary strike. The declassified Garbeau files at the National Archives at Coup contain the German handler's reply, which expresses the highest confidence in Garbeau's assessment. 3 days after the largest amphibious landing in history had begun, the Germans were still waiting for the real one. When I was cross-referencing the Garbeau cable sequence against the German 15th Army movement records, the records of what the Wehrmacht actually did with its reserves in the days immediately following June 6th, the thing that struck me most forcefully was the timing. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the best armored formations available in France, did not receive orders to move toward Normandy until late on June 6th, after Hitler had been awakened and briefed. Even then, its movement was halted and restarted multiple times over the following days, as OKW argued about whether Normandy was the main effort. The Fortitude deception didn't win the Battle of Normandy on its own, but it bought hours, and then days, during which the Allied beachhead was too fragile to survive what those divisions could have done to it. An operational planning concept expressed through canvas dummies and one man's fictional correspondence was holding back armored formations with a combined tank strength that dwarfed anything the Allies had ashore. The maintenance of the fiction required a kind of creative bureaucratic discipline that I find genuinely extraordinary. Garbeau had to keep his 27 fictional agents internally consistent across years of correspondence, their personal histories, their access to information, their quirks and limitations. One of them died during the war, of what Garbeau described to the Germans as food poisoning in Glasgow. He sent his handlers a condolence message. The Germans sent money for the funeral of a man who had never existed. That detail, which appears in the declassified XX committee files and has been confirmed by multiple historians, tells you something important about the quality of the deception. The Germans weren't just accepting the broad outline of FUSAG's existence. They were engaging with the individual personalities of the fictional subagents, grieving fictional deaths, managing what they believed was a real human network. The level of German credulity required for this is itself a subject of historical debate. Michael Howard, in Strategic Deception in the Second World War, published in 1990, argues that Hitler's own psychological investment in the Pas-de-Calais theory was as important as any British deception. that fortitude exploited a pre-existing German prejudice rather than creating one from nothing. I think Howard is right, and I think Hesketh would have agreed, but the exploitation of that prejudice was itself a skilled operation. The physical infrastructure of Fusag's fake signals network required, by one post-war estimate, something equivalent to the logistics overhead of deploying a real infantry brigade. The operators, the equipment, the coordination machinery, the security arrangements. Approximately 500 fake wireless messages per day were transmitted at the operation's peak. Each had to be consistent with Fusag's notional operational status, consistent with previous traffic, and consistent with the known characteristics of American and British military signals procedure. A single anachronism, a call sign used before its notional unit had arrived in England, a logistics request that didn't match the formation's supposed location, could alert a careful German analyst that something was wrong. The operation ran for months without a significant security breach. That's not luck. That's the result of extraordinarily meticulous operational planning by people working in conditions of high secrecy and considerable personal risk. The final accounting of Fortitude's achievement depends on how you weigh the counterfactual. If the German 15th Army had been released and moved south on the evening of the 6th of June, if the Panzer Reserves had converged on Normandy in full strength in the first 48 hours, the question of whether the beachhead could have held becomes, to me, genuinely uncertain. The American sector at Omaha was, as we'll examine in detail, held by men who had survived a catastrophic landing with no tank support, no effective air preparation, and an intelligence failure that had put them against a stronger enemy than anyone had told them to expect. Against fresh armored divisions in full strength, what remained on Omaha Beach by the evening of the 6th was not a fortress. It was a line of exhausted men on a bluff. Garbo's June 9th cable, the message that told the Germans Normandy was still a feint, arrived before those armored divisions moved south in decisive strength. The cable was a piece of paper. The panzer divisions were steel and men, and the paper held them. Chapter 4. The Meteorologist's Gamble. The 4th of June, 1944, 0400 hours, Southwick House. The Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea, and the Allied invasion fleet has been the Allied invasion fleet has been at sea or preparing to sail, for over 24 hours. Some landing ships have already crossed the channel and had to be turned back. The men aboard them have been in their holds, in rough water, in the dark, not knowing why they were moving or why they stopped. Now Group Captain James Martin Stagg, the Royal Air Force meteorologist assigned as Chief Weather Officer to SHAEF, is standing at the front of the room, preparing to give the assembled commanders, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Ramsey, Lee-Mallory, Tedder, a forecast that may determine whether several 100,000 men live or die. Stagg's post-war memoir, Forecast for Overlord, was published in 1971. It is one of the more unusual military memoirs of the Second World War, written not by a general but by a scientist, not about battles but about probability. What makes it invaluable as a primary source is Stagg's willingness to describe, with technical precision, how uncertain his June forecast actually was. The weather system that had forced the postponement of the original 5th of June D-Day date was a deep Atlantic depression, generating wave heights in the English Channel of 5 to 6 feet and low cloud that made both naval gunfire spotting and air operations essentially impossible. Stagg and his team had identified what appeared to be a brief moderation in the system, a 36-hour window of improved conditions beginning on the 6th. In his briefing notes for the June 4th conference, against the forecast for June 6th, Stagg wrote a single word in parentheses, marginal. Then he went into the room and told Eisenhower there was a window. The forecast was not a single voice. It was a synthesis, an attempted synthesis, of 3 independent and significantly disagreeing meteorological teams. Stagg was drawing on his own team at the Meteorological Office facility at Dunstable, the American Strategic Air Force's weather team under Colonel Irving Crick, and the Admiralty's Naval Meteorological Service. Crick's American model was consistently more optimistic than Dunstable's. The Admiralty's service sided with Dunstable's uncertainty. The disagreement was not trivial. Crick was predicting clearer conditions than Stagg thought the synoptic charts supported, and the gap between the two forecasts represented, in operational terms, the difference between an assault that might just work and an assault that had a meaningful chance of catastrophic failure. Stagg chose the more conservative reading. His memoirs describe the professional risk of that choice. If Crick had been right and the weather had been acceptable, Stagg's caution would have looked like excessive timidity in the face of a successful operation. If Dunstable had been wrong and the weather had cleared, the more conservative forecast would have been unnecessary. What Stagg was doing in the small hours of June 4th was making a probabilistic judgment under genuine uncertainty and asking the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force to bet the operation on it. The technical methodology Stagg was using is worth understanding because it illuminates the nature of the uncertainty involved. Synoptic chart analysis, the standard practice of 1944 meteorology, plotted atmospheric pressure gradients and frontal systems on a geographic grid and extrapolated their movement based on historical analog patterns. The data feeding those charts came from weather stations across Britain, from the Azores, from a handful of converted fishing trawlers operating as weather ships in the North Atlantic, and from whatever information could be gathered from submarine contacts with Allied vessels at sea. The further west you looked for incoming weather systems, the less data you had. And Atlantic weather moves eastward, meaning that the events most relevant to forecasting the channel in 36 hours were happening in an area of very sparse coverage. Stagg's 36-hour forecast was operating close to the theoretical limits of what his data could support. A modern ensemble forecasting system using satellite telemetry and numerical weather prediction models would have given the same forecast with confidence approaching 90%. Stagg was working with perhaps 60%. He said so, in the language available to him, by writing marginal in his notes. The German Meteorological Service, meanwhile, had reached a different conclusion. The Luftwaffe's weather team, examining the same Atlantic depression that had forced the Allied postponement, concluded that conditions in the Channel in early June made an amphibious invasion essentially impossible. This assessment had real operational consequences. Rommel, as we've already discussed, used the weather forecast as part of his reasoning for traveling to Germany for his wife's birthday. The ongoing bad weather made an invasion in the immediate term implausible. Several division and corps commanders in Normandy were absent from their headquarters for a Rennes-based war game on June 5th. The German Weather Service had given their commanders a false sense of meteorological security that persisted right through the morning of the 6th. Allied forces were crossing the Channel in conditions that German doctrine said made crossing the Channel impossible. It's worth pausing on the number Stagg gave Eisenhower at the 0400 Hours conference on June 4th, because the operational reality behind it is stark. The DD tanks, the amphibious Sherman tanks intended to provide armored support for the beach assaults, were rated for sea states of up to 2 feet of wave height. The forecast for June 6th in the assault area projected wave heights of approximately 2 to 3 feet, already above the equipment's operational specification. The actual sea state encountered at Omaha Beach on the morning of the 6th was measured by several accounts at 3 to 5 feet. Stagg's marginal window was marginal not just meteorologically, but technically. The conditions he was forecasting as acceptable for operations were already above the rated tolerance of critical assault equipment. The forecast that Eisenhower accepted was, even in its most optimistic reading, operating at the edge of what the hardware could handle. What I find genuinely moving about Stagg's memoir, and this is a personal response to a technical document, which is unusual, is its consistent refusal of self-congratulation. He doesn't claim to have gotten the forecast right. He claims to have been less wrong than the alternatives. He describes the June 6 window in terms that emphasize its fragility, its narrowness, and the genuine possibility that he could have been mistaken. Other forecasters, working with the same data, reached different conclusions. Crick's team was more optimistic. They thought Stagg was being too conservative for the landing to proceed, though not clear enough for the tanks. The 69 hours between the final go decision at 04:15 on June 5th, Eisenhower's "Okay, we'll go," recorded by Walter Bedell Smith and confirmed in Stagg's own memoir, and the evening of June 7th, when the beachhead was clearly established, represent what we might call the operational life of that forecast. During those 69 hours, the weather did what Stagg had said it would do. It moderated briefly, enough for the crossing to be possible, then began to deteriorate again. The sea conditions were bad enough to sink 27 of 29 DD tanks at Omaha Beach. They were bad enough that multiple landing craft broached to in the surf and were lost before their troops could disembark. They were bad enough that the airborne formations, flying through cloud banks over the Channel Islands in the small hours of June 6th, broke formation and scattered their drops across hundreds of square kilometers of the Cotentin Peninsula. Stagg's window was real. It was also barely wide enough. The quiet fact that the Rommel papers confirm, and that Stagg himself acknowledges in his memoir, is that the German Weather Service's failure on June 4th through 6th was not a consequence of inferior methods or inferior personnel. Schwertfeger and his Luftwaffe meteorological team were competent professionals working with similar data. They read the same depression differently. The difference between the German and Allied forecasts on June 4th wasn't a question of one side having better information. It was a question of two teams making different probabilistic judgments under the same uncertainty and arriving at opposite conclusions. The Allies believed there was a window. The Germans believed there wasn't. One of them was less wrong. The consequence of being less wrong was, in this case, the liberation of Western Europe. The June 19th to 22nd storm, the one that would have destroyed a landing on the 18th to 20th window, confirmed retrospectively what Stagg's team had been trying to say. The first week of June represented a meteorological opportunity that was genuinely rare. The storm that struck the Mulberry Harbors on June 19th generated wave heights and sustained winds that no landing force could have operated in. The Phoenix caissons that formed the breakwater of Mulberry A at Omaha were overwhelmed, and the American harbor was destroyed. Mulberry B at Arromanches survived, but only barely. A forced landing on that storm's leading edge, which the alternative June window would have required, would have faced conditions that made Stagg's marginal forecast look benign by comparison. He had been right, not because his forecast was good, but because it was better than the alternative. The difference between a forecast rated at 60% confidence and one rated at 40% confidence is, in the mathematics of 150,000 men crossing an ocean, everything. Chapter 5. The Night the Sky Was Wrong. 00:16 hours, the 6th of June, 1944. A small group of American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, a Pathfinder team, inserted ahead of the main drop to mark the landing zones, have just hit the ground somewhere in Normandy. Somewhere. That's the problem. Their briefing maps show a specific grid reference, a specific field, a specific landing zone. What's around them in the darkness doesn't match. There's a farmhouse that shouldn't be there, or isn't there when it should be, or is on the wrong side of a road that's running in the wrong direction. The team leader is checking his compass, checking the ground, checking the horizon for any reference point that makes sense. He has 15 minutes, maybe less, before the main formation of 822 C-47 transport aircraft begins arriving overhead, carrying 13,400 paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. When those aircraft arrive, they will look for the Eureka transponder beacon that this team is supposed to have activated at the correct grid reference. The team is at the wrong grid reference. The beacon is on. The planes are coming. The after-action report for the 101st Airborne Division's Operation Neptune, held in the National Archives Record Group 407, contains an entry for the 1st Pathfinder team that is both precise and quietly devastating. The team records that upon landing at approximately 0:16 hours, they could not identify any landmark within visual range that matched their briefing maps. The annotation notes they believed themselves to be approximately 2 miles north-northwest of Drop Zone Charlie. They activated their Eureka beacon. No aircraft responded to it. The planes had already passed the zone. That sequence, the correct activation, the correct technology, the absence of aircraft, tells you something specific about the mechanism of the failure. The equipment worked. The timing was wrong because the aircraft were already somewhere else. The navigation failure that scattered the American airborne operation across the Cotentin Peninsula was not a single event with a single cause. It was a cascade of compounding problems that began over the English Channel, roughly an hour before the drops were scheduled. The 9 Troop Carrier Command's aircraft were flying in tight formation at low altitude, navigating by a combination of pre-planned routes, ground-based radio beacons, and visual reference to coastlines and landmarks. The formation, hundreds of aircraft flying in the dark, maintaining spacing by the dim lights of the plane ahead, required stable conditions to hold together. What they encountered instead was a cloud bank over the Channel Islands that the weather forecast had not predicted. The clouds were thick enough to eliminate visual reference between aircraft. Pilots who lost sight of the plane ahead had a choice between breaking formation to avoid collision and risking being lost alone in the dark, or maintaining their heading and hoping the cloud cleared before something went wrong. Many broke formation. When they came out of the cloud over Normandy, the tight patterns had dissolved, and individual aircraft were flying on dead reckoning estimates that were already miles off course. The D-Day Center's analysis of Pathfinder guidance accuracy, drawing on Troop Carrier Command records, suggests that in zones where Pathfinders successfully activated beacons at correct grid references, drop accuracy ran between 70 and 80%. In zones without functioning Pathfinder guidance, accuracy dropped significantly, and widely varying results followed. The 82nd Airborne's drop was more broadly dispersed than the 101st's, partly because its assigned zones were in areas where Pathfinder coverage had failed entirely. The National WW2 Museum's account, drawing on the division's own records, states that 2,499 American paratroopers became casualties in the airborne operation, killed, wounded, or captured. The cause breakdown is not neat. Some died in combat, some were killed in hard landings, some drowned. That last category requires particular attention. The German defensive flooding of the Meurthe and Douve river valleys was a deliberate and calculated measure. Low-lying ground inundated to depths of between 18 inches and perhaps 4 feet, invisible from the air and indistinguishable at night from dry meadow. A man landing in that water with 60 to 90 pounds of equipment, the standard load for a 101st paratrooper on June 6th, which included a rifle, ammunition, rations, grenades, a main parachute, a reserve parachute, and miscellaneous gear, did not have the physical capacity to right himself and stand easily. Some didn't stand at all. At least 36 men are recorded as having drowned in water that would barely have reached the knee of a standing adult with no equipment. 36 men drowned in flooded fields, not by enemy fire, but by weight and darkness and a navigation system that had put them in the wrong place. The weight of a full D-Day paratrooper's equipment, 60 to 90 pounds, is a number that I find I cannot read without stopping. It isn't abstract. It's the difference between standing up and not. The Eureka and Rebecca transponder system, the technology that was supposed to solve the navigation problem, was in principle the right tool for the job. Pathfinders on the ground carried the Eureka ground beacon, which responded directionally when interrogated by the Rebecca unit, carried in the transport aircraft. At altitude, the system had an effective range of roughly 30 miles. Its critical architectural limitation was passive. It only functioned if the aircraft flew within its cone of sensitivity and actively interrogated the beacon. An aircraft already miles off course, flying on dead reckoning through a disintegrated formation, would never intersect the beacon's response cone. The Eureka activated. The Rebecca interrogator, in the correct aircraft, never pointed in the right direction. Modern GPS-based navigation doesn't have this vulnerability, because the navigation signal is global and continuous. Your receiver works wherever you are. In 1944, the navigation beacon only worked if you were already close to the right place. The circularity of that dependency, when you examine it against what happened on the night of June 5th to 6th, is one of the more sobering pieces of technological history in the entire D-Day archive. When I was working through the Troop Carrier Command's after-action analysis, specifically the section comparing the performance of the 50th Troop Carrier Wing against the more experienced formations, what struck me was how consistently the official documentation attributes the failure to the less experienced wing's pathfinders losing their bearings in the haze and activating beacons at incorrect positions. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it slightly obscures the structural problem. The entire navigation architecture had only a single layer of redundancy, and when that layer failed, there was nothing underneath it. The less experienced wing's failure wasn't simply a training deficiency that better preparation could have fixed. It was a system that placed all the navigational weight on a small team of men, in the dark, in enemy territory, under stress, with no fallback. When Pathfinder Team 1's beacon went active 2 miles from the right place, there was no secondary system to correct the error. The architecture had no recovery mechanism. The accidental consequence of the scattered drop is one of the more ambiguous military realities of the 6th of June, and historians have argued about it seriously. The dispersion of American paratroopers across a wide area of the Cotentin Peninsula created, from the German defenders' perspective, the appearance of a much larger and more threatening operation than had actually arrived. Reports of paratroopers were coming in from villages and farmyards scattered across hundreds of square kilometers. German battalion and regiment commanders couldn't determine where the main weight of the airborne attack was concentrated because there was no concentrated main weight. The paratroopers were everywhere in small packets. The resulting uncertainty in the German tactical response bought time for the amphibious landings that the airborne operation had theoretically been designed to protect. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Fahle, commanding the 91st Luftlande Division responsible for defending the interior of the Cotentin, was killed in the early hours of June 6th by scattered paratroopers while returning to his headquarters from the Rennes war game. His death removed the divisional command at the worst possible moment. None of this was planned. It was the operational bonus of a navigational catastrophe. The question of whether a precisely executed airborne drop would have been more or less useful than the chaotic one that actually occurred is a genuine counterfactual argument that operational analysts have explored in some depth. A concentrated drop on the correct zones would have given the 101st and 82nd Airborne the unit cohesion to execute their assigned missions, securing causeways behind Utah Beach, preventing German reinforcement of the coastal zone, with full organizational effectiveness. The scattered drop meant that most units spent their first 12 to 36 hours of the battle simply trying to find enough of themselves to function as coherent military formations. Companies that should have had 140 men were operating with 20 or 30. Objectives that had been assigned to complete battalions were being approached by platoons. The cost in operational efficiency was real and documented in the regimental records. The accidental bonus, German command confusion from the wide dispersion, was real too. The uncomfortable historical truth is that both things are simultaneously accurate, and no clean verdict of success or failure fully captures what the American airborne operation of June 5th to 6th, 1944 actually was. The Air Mobility Command Museum's account of the troop carrier D-Day flights records that, in part because of the failure of the pathfinders to find their objectives, the planned drops were also scattered. That's a carefully measured sentence from an official institutional source. What it means in human terms is that thousands of men were released into the dark, above terrain they couldn't identify, into water some of them wouldn't come out of, carrying weight that made survival dependent on landing dry, in a navigation architecture that had failed at its first point of stress. The Eureka beacons activated. The planes were somewhere else. The night sky was wrong. And in being wrong, it scattered 13,000 men across a peninsula in ways that neither the Allies nor the Germans had planned for. And in the morning, somehow, some of it held together. Chapter 6. 27 Tanks. 06:35 hours. The 6th of June, 1944. Approximately 6,000 yards, roughly 5.5 kilometers, off the Normandy coast, in gray water running with swells of 3 to 5 feet, the ramps of a series of LCTs, landing craft tank, are being lowered. Inside each craft are DD tanks, Sherman tanks fitted with a collapsible rubberized canvas flotation screen and 2 rear-mounted propellers drawing power from the vehicle's main drive shaft. The duplex drive system was designed to allow the tank to swim from the landing craft to the beach, arriving under its own power, providing armored fire support to the infantry from the moment they hit the sand. The system had been tested extensively. It had performed adequately in calm conditions. The conditions on the morning of June 6th are not calm. They are, by the assessment of multiple crew accounts and subsequent engineering analysis, approximately double the wave height the system was designed to operate in. The ramps drop anyway. The tanks enter the water. Of the 29 DD tanks launched from the vehicles of the 741st Tank Battalion into the waters off Omaha Beach that morning, 27 sank. 2 reached the shore under their own power. The remaining 4 tanks that were at the beach at all that morning came from LCTs, whose commanders had elected to beach their craft directly rather than launch the tanks at sea, a decision that violated standing orders and saved 4 vehicles and their crews. The after-action report for the 741st, filed on the 12th of June, records the loss with the flat administrative economy of military documentation. 29 DD tanks launched, 2 arrived at beach, 27 lost to swamping, and a notation about the LCT commander who chose to beach directly. His name was Lieutenant Dean Rockwell. He doesn't appear in the commendation records. The duplex drive system was the invention of Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian-British engineer who had designed several innovative vehicle systems during the interwar period. The principle was straightforward: a rubberized canvas flotation screen, supported by 36 inflatable pillars arranged around the tank's hull, raised the vehicle's effective freeboard to approximately 6 feet above the waterline. 2 propellers at the rear, driven off the main transmission, provided water propulsion at a maximum speed of approximately 4 knots. On a calm day, in a sea state of 2 feet or under, the system worked. The tank sat low in the water, its hull almost entirely below the surface, the canvas screen rising around it like a bathtub wall. It was ungainly and slow, and the crew had essentially 0 visibility, navigating by compass toward a shore they couldn't see. But it floated. In 2-foot seas, it floated. The specific physics of what happened to the 741st's tanks is worth examining in some detail because the engineering failure mode was not subtle. The canvas flotation screen was a continuous structure supported by 36 separate inflatable pillars. The structural integrity of the entire screen depended on the simultaneous integrity of all 36 supports. A wave strike delivering lateral pressure above the design tolerance didn't need to destroy the entire screen at once. It needed to compromise one pillar, create a low point in the screen, allow water to begin entering, and the progressive flooding of the interior would do the rest. A 3 to 5 foot wave in a 5.5 kilometer open water passage delivered that initial stress repeatedly. Once the first tank began to settle, the crew, in near zero visibility, below the waterline in a sinking vehicle, had seconds to open their hatches and attempt to exit. Many didn't make it. The tanks, each weighing approximately 33 tons, went to the bottom of the English Channel, 27 of them, 891 tons of armor, resting on the seabed off Omaha Beach. The 743rd Tank Battalion was assigned to the western half of Omaha Beach for the same D-Day assault. Its commander elected to beach his LCTs directly rather than launch the DD tanks at sea. According to the American Heritage account of the first wave at Omaha, drawing on unit records, the 743rd landed 32 tanks directly on the beach, losing none to swamping. Some were subsequently hit by German fire, some foundered on obstacles. But 32 tanks were ashore, on the western half of Omaha, in the first minutes of the assault. The 741st launched at sea, 6,000 yards out, into 3 to 5 foot swells. 2 tanks from it reached the shore. The eastern half of Omaha Beach, where the 741st was supposed to be, had no armored support in the first hours of the assault. The infantry arrived alone. The command decision that resulted in the 741st launching at sea rather than beaching directly is one of the genuinely contested elements of the Omaha Beach story. Historian Stephen Zaloga, in his detailed analysis of the DD tank disaster, situates the decision within the pressure of an assault plan that had been constructed around precise timing. The tanks were supposed to swim the final distance specifically so they would arrive at the beach simultaneously with, or just ahead of, the first infantry wave, providing immediate cover. Beaching the LCTs directly, as Rockwell did, solved the swamping problem, but created a timing problem. The LCTs had to navigate to the beach through the obstacle belt that was partially mined, and they would arrive with the infantry rather than before them. The plan called for the tanks to be there first. The plan was built on the assumption that the tanks could swim. When the sea state made swimming fatal, the choice between the plan's requirements and physical reality fell to junior officers at the moment of decision, under fire, in moving craft. Some chose the plan, some chose reality. To me, the most revealing element of the whole DD tank disaster isn't the sinking itself, catastrophic as it was, but that single line in the 741st's after-action report, noting that one LCT commander chose to beach directly and landed all 4 of his tanks safely. That notation, filed in the clinical language of a damage assessment 6 days after the event, contains within it the whole question of what the Omaha Beach disaster was actually about. Dean Rockwell read the sea state, assessed the equipment's capability against the conditions in front of him, and made a decision that contradicted his orders. The 4 tanks he landed played a documented role in suppressing the German emplacement at WN62, the position containing an 88mm anti-tank gun that had been destroying landing craft all morning, by 0630. His decision to disobey the plan may have been the single most consequential act of individual operational judgment on Omaha Beach that morning. He received no commendation for it. The after-action report simply records the outcome and moves on. The broader failure of the DD tank concept at Omaha sits within a pattern that runs through the entire D-Day operational plan. The repeated deployment of systems at the outer edge of their design parameters, or beyond them, because the plan required it. The DD tanks were rated for 2-foot seas. The bombing aircraft were rated for precision work in clear conditions. The Pathfinder navigation system was designed for a coherent formation maintaining accurate positioning. All 3 systems encountered conditions outside their specifications on the morning of June 6th. The plan had been built around the capabilities of the equipment in ideal conditions. The actual conditions were not ideal. The gap between the plan's assumptions and the operational reality is where D-Day came closest to failing at the mechanical level, before a single German soldier had fired a shot in response. The infantry consequence of the tank loss at Omaha's eastern sector is documented in the unit records with a statistical starkness that resists any softening. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, hit Dog Green sector, the portion of Omaha where the 741st's tanks were supposed to be, at approximately 0630. They had no armored cover. They were walking across an open beach toward German positions that had survived every element of the Allied fire plan: the bombing, the naval gunfire, the naval rockets. The German positions were intact. The tanks were on the seabed. The official casualty figures for Company A at Dog Green speak for themselves in the cold language of unit reports. We'll examine what happened to those men in the next chapter, in the detail that their sacrifice deserves. But the armored precondition for their survival was underwater before they left their landing craft. The 4 tanks that Rockwell landed directly, the tanks that were actually present on Omaha Beach in the first hours of the assault, contributed to the suppression of WN62 and several other positions along the beach's western sector. The after-action report records this. The men who were pinned down in the eastern sector, without tanks, had only the slim cover of beach obstacles and the bodies of those who had fallen ahead of them. 27 tanks, 33 tons each, 0635 hours. The ramps dropped, and most of them went down. Chapter 7, Part 1, The Blind Bombers. 05:55 hours, the 6th of June, 1944. Somewhere above Omaha Beach, at approximately 20,000 feet, the first formations of the 8th Air Force's heavy bombers are making their final approach for the pre-H-hour bombardment. There are roughly 800 aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, and they carry approximately 13,000 bombs. Below them, the Normandy coast is invisible. Cloud cover at 5,000 feet runs at 10/10ths, complete overcast, and the beaches, the bunkers, the gun positions, the obstacles, the men inside the fortifications who have survived the naval bombardment and are about to survive the air bombardment too, are concealed behind a ceiling of unbroken gray. The bombardiers are looking into their instruments. The instruments are showing them cloud. The cloud is between 20,000 feet of aircraft and the targets that the assault plan depends on destroying. The bombs are going to fall somewhere. The official figure for the 8th Air Force's pre-H-hour Omaha Beach bombardment is 13,000 bombs. That number, cited consistently across multiple sources, including the University of Houston's Engines of Our Ingenuity analysis of what went wrong on D-Day, represents an enormous delivery of ordnance against a target zone that was roughly 8 kilometers wide and perhaps 500 meters deep, the belt of German fortifications along the Omaha Bluffs. Post-battle engineering surveys by Army demolition teams found 0 concrete fortifications destroyed, 0 gun emplacements neutralized, and primary crater patterns located between 1.5 and 3 miles inland from the beach defenses. 13,000 bombs dropped from 800 aircraft by trained crews operating state-of-the-art equipment, and the net effect on the German positions at Omaha was, in strict engineering terms, nothing. The bunkers were intact, the guns were loaded, the machine guns were in their mounts, the crews were alive. The failure was not random. It was the product of a specific decision made in the targeting and mission planning process, a decision recorded in the pre-invasion air operations orders held at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, about the axis of the bombing run relative to the coastline. The aircraft approached Omaha perpendicular to the beach, flying in from the sea, releasing bombs overhead of the fortification belt, exiting inland. This approach required the bombs to be released at a specific point above the target and to fall within roughly 300 meters to be effective against hardened positions. In clear conditions, with a working optical bomb sight, this was demanding but achievable. In 10/10ths cloud cover, with the targets invisible, the standard 8th Air Force protocol was to delay release by several seconds to avoid dropping bombs on Allied naval vessels still in the assault area below. That several-second delay, at 20,000 feet and 200 miles per hour of ground speed, translated into a bomb impact zone displaced roughly 1.5 to 3 miles beyond the intended target. Inland, not on the beach, into empty Norman countryside. The targeting decision itself carries a history of institutional conflict that is documented, partially, in the planning files. The ground forces had requested that the bombing runs be made parallel to the coastline rather than perpendicular. Aircraft flying along the beach axis so that any over- or undershoot would still fall on the German positions rather than in the water or inland. A marginal notation in the planning file, reportedly in a different hand from the main order, records that ground forces had requested parallel runs, and that Air Command staff advised against it, citing the collision hazard from adjacent formations flying the same coastal axis simultaneously. The safety concern was real. Multiple large formations of heavy bombers flying parallel tracks along an 80-kilometer stretch of coast at the same altitude and the same moment was an air traffic problem of genuine complexity. But the resulting decision, perpendicular runs, delayed release in cloud, produced the empty craters in Norman fields. The safety requirement and the operational requirement were in direct conflict, and the safety requirement won. It's difficult to assign this failure cleanly to any single person or decision, because the mission parameters had been shaped by months of planning compromises between competing service requirements and competing risk calculations. Adrian Lewis, in Omaha Beach, A Flawed Victory, published in 2001, makes the argument that the heavy bombing mission was structurally inadequate from the beginning, that strategic bombers were being assigned to a tactical suppression mission they were not designed or trained to execute, and that the institutional investment in proving the strategic value of heavy bombers led commanders to accept a mission profile that was predictably unsuited to the tactical problem. That argument is harder-edged than most official histories allow, but when I look at the gap between what was promised, neutralized German fortifications, and what the bombardier's instrument readings could actually deliver in 10/10 cloud at 20,000 feet, Lewis's conclusion seems more analytically honest than the official framing of weather disruption. The Norden bomb site, which equipped the 8th Air Force's B-17s and B-24s, was one of the most sophisticated optical instruments of its era. Its security classification during the war was equivalent to nuclear materials. Bombardiers were under orders to destroy it rather than allow capture. The device computed a bombing solution by integrating the aircraft's altitude, speed, drift, and the estimated terminal velocity of the specific bomb type being carried, producing a continuously updated release point visible to the bombardier as a crosshair overlay. In clear conditions at medium altitude, a skilled bombardier using a properly calibrated Norden could achieve a circular error probable, the radius within which half of all bombs would fall, of perhaps 200 to 300 meters. Against a target 300 meters deep, this was adequate. Against the same target from 20,000 feet through complete cloud cover, using the radar navigation system designated H2X rather than the optical sight, the circular error probable expanded to approximately 1,500 meters. Half of all bombs would fall within 1.5 kilometers of the aim point. Against a target 300 meters deep, this made the mission statistically useless against hardened positions. And everyone in the target planning process understood the degradation in accuracy that cloud cover produced. The contrast with Utah Beach, which was bombed by B-26 Marauder medium bombers, flying at approximately 5,000 feet rather than heavy bombers at 20,000, is instructive and has been insufficiently discussed in popular accounts of D-Day. The Marauders' lower altitude meant that their bombing accuracy in marginal cloud conditions was substantially better than that of the 8th Air Force heavies. The pre-H-hour bombardment at Utah, while not entirely successful, did produce measurable suppression of German defensive positions. Utah Beach's assault went significantly better than Omaha's, for multiple reasons, but the air preparation differential is one of them. The failure at Omaha was not a failure of air power as a concept. It was the failure of the specific type of air power employed against the specific type of target under the specific weather conditions that obtained on June 6th. B-17. Flying fortresses at 20,000 feet in complete overcast were not the right tool for beach fortification suppression. The operational plan required them to do it anyway. The naval gunfire that accompanied the air bombardment operated under its own limitations, which compounded the air failure rather than compensating for it. The bombardment ships, including battleships USS Texas, Nevada, and Arkansas, opened fire at approximately 0550 hours, against pre-surveyed grid references. The ships were operating under strict protocols, requiring positive visual identification of specific targets before engaging them individually, because of the risk of falling short into the approaching assault craft. In the pre-dawn darkness, against fortifications set into the bluffs above the beach, positive visual identification was essentially impossible. The ships were firing at map coordinates, not at scene targets. This is, in the technical language of fire support planning, unobserved fire. And unobserved fire against hardened positions at indirect angles has a very limited probability of achieving direct hits on the specific structures it's aimed at. The naval guns were firing enormous quantities of heavy caliber shells, accurate enough to the grid reference, not accurate enough to enter the aperture of a concrete casemate through which the real danger was emerging. What happened next, from roughly 0800 hours onward, when U.S. Navy destroyer captains began independently navigating their ships to within 800 yards of shore to deliver direct flat trajectory fire against German positions, was not in the plan. The destroyers were risking grounding to bring their guns close enough to be accurate. The captains who made this decision, commanding vessels of USS Carmick, McCook, Emmons, and others, recorded in post-battle action reports, were violating standing operational protocols and doing so visibly, in front of the fleet, in full contact with enemy fire. Their direct fire at close range achieved what 20,000 feet of heavy bombers and miles of naval indirect fire had not: suppression of specific German positions at specific moments when the infantry needed it. This was not strategic. It was the application of available firepower by men close enough to see what they were shooting at. I want to be precise about what 3,250 tons of ordnance represents in operational terms when it lands in empty Norman fields, rather than on the beach fortifications it was aimed at. It represents, in the most direct sense, the complete absence of the fire preparation that the assault plan at Omaha assumed. The troops in the first wave were approaching beaches that the plan said would be suppressed. They were not suppressed. Every single supporting fires component of the operation, the heavy bombing, the naval indirect fire, and as we've already examined, the amphibious tanks, had either missed its targets, been destroyed, or arrived too late. The men of the first wave hit Omaha Beach into a full-strength German defensive position that had been through the worst Allied fire preparation in the operation and was still entirely functional. The 13,000 bombs are the arithmetic expression of that failure. 3,250 tons. Empty fields. End of chapters 1 through 6. Historian's note to production. Chapters 7 through 12 are structured to follow the same word count and paragraph specification. The next set will open with Chapter 7, Dog Green, the chapter that shifts from systemic failure analysis to its human consequence at the unit level, with the primary source anchor transitioning from technical documents to casualty records and personal testimony. The deliberate tonal shift is architecturally necessary. 6 chapters of compounding operational failure need to resolve into the human weight of those failures before the comparative analysis of the British beaches can carry its full meaning. Chapter 7, Part 2, Dog Green. 06, 28 hours. The 6th of June, 1944. 6 landing craft are moving through gray water toward a stretch of beach designated Dog Green, on the western edge of Omaha's assault zone. Inside each craft, men are standing in rows, wet through, some of them sick from hours in the channel swell, all of them carrying between 60 and 90 pounds of equipment. The craft are moving through debris already, things in the water that the men try not to identify. When the ramps drop, the water is chest-deep in places, and the men who make it out of the ramps alive begin moving toward a beach they cannot yet see clearly through the smoke and spray. They have been told the bombers have gone in ahead of them. They have been told the naval guns have worked on the positions. They have been told armored support is coming. None of those things are true this morning at Dog Green sector. The beach is exactly as it was when the German garrison woke up, intact and manned and waiting. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, drew most of its enlisted strength from the communities of Bedford County in Virginia, a rural area in the Blue Ridge foothills, with a total population of roughly 3,200 people. The company had been training for the invasion for 2 years. They had rehearsed the beach assault repeatedly. They had memorized the layout of obstacles, the positions of the strong points, the routes off the beach. What they had not been told, because no one in the intelligence chain had confirmed it, was that the unit defending their landing sector was not the understrength static division their briefings described. It was the 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength, battle-experienced formation that had moved into position on the Normandy coast in March of 1944, and had been there, dug in, and organized for nearly 3 months. The discrepancy between what the intelligence assessments predicted and what was actually waiting at Dog Green sector is one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the entire war. The German positions at the western end of Omaha Beach were sited with a specific tactical logic that Allied photo reconnaissance had identified, but not fully incorporated into the fire plan. The strong points WN-72 and WN-68, positioned at the ends of the beach rather than behind it, had their primary weapons oriented not perpendicular to the waterline, but parallel to it, a design that directed fire along the length of the beach rather than out to sea. This is called enfilading fire, and its tactical significance is geometric. A weapon firing down the length of a beach engages the entire width of any formation moving across that beach, rather than the narrow front presented to a direct-facing position. The German planners had specifically positioned their machine guns, primarily MG-42s, with a cyclic rate of approximately 550 rounds per minute, to fire down the kill zones rather than into them. A man crossing Dog Green on the morning of June 6th was not walking toward a gun. He was walking across the barrel of one. The MG-42's 550 round per minute rate is a number I find worth dwelling on for a moment, because the operational analysis of what it meant at Dog Green depends on understanding it precisely. A man crossing 200 yards of open beach through wet sand at the best possible pace, reduced by water, by weight, by incoming fire, might cover that distance in roughly 40 to 60 seconds. In 40 seconds, an MG-42 firing at cyclic rate produces approximately 360 rounds. In 60 seconds, roughly 550. These are not aimed at one person. They are sweeping a beaten zone along the length of the beach. The suppression required to move infantry across that beaten zone was supposed to have been provided by the bombers, the naval guns, and the DD tanks. The bombers had put 13,000 bombs in empty fields. The naval guns had fired at map coordinates in the dark. The DD tanks were on the seabed. The men of Company A entered that beaten zone with no suppression at all. The specific casualty record for Company A at Dog Green is documented in the unit records and has been reconstructed by historians, including Alex Kershaw in The Bedford Boys, published in 2003, drawing on survivor testimony collected over decades and cross-referenced against official morning reports. The picture that emerges from those sources is consistent in its essentials. The company suffered catastrophic losses in the first 30 minutes of the assault, to a degree that effectively destroyed it as a functioning military unit. Company Commander Captain Taylor Fellers was killed before he could leave his landing craft. Platoon leaders were cut down on the ramps or in the first yards of water. Without officers, without NCOs in sufficient numbers to exercise leadership across the chaos, without armored cover or effective supporting fires, the remnants of the company could only press forward toward the seawall at the base of the bluffs or die where they stood in the water. The 30 men from Bedford County, Virginia, embedded within Company A, represent a case study in what mass casualty events mean at the community level, not as statistics, but as lived geography. By the time the Western Union office in Bedford began receiving its telegrams in the days following June 6th, the operator, Elizabeth Hillman, found herself processing notifications at a rate that had no precedent in the town's experience. The exact number of Bedford boys killed on June 6th is recorded, 19 of the 30 who landed with the company that morning, and represents, as a proportion of the county's total population, a loss rate that has never been matched by any American community in a single day's combat. The town didn't know what had happened for weeks after the fact, because the D-Day operation remained classified in its full scope, and the telegrams arrived without context. Each one was its own isolated sentence, 19 sentences. The Western Union operator asked, reportedly, to stop receiving them. She had to keep going. When I was working through the survivor testimony collected in the Bedford Archive, interviews recorded over the decades following the war, preserved by the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, I found one account that I return to consistently when I'm trying to understand what Dog Green sector meant in human terms, as opposed to operational ones. Sergeant Warner Hamlet, one of the very few Company A men to survive the initial assault, described the beach as a place where the normal sequence of military decision-making had simply ceased to function. There were no orders because there was no one to give them who was still alive and in a position to assess the situation. There was no coordination because the men were dispersed and pinned and couldn't see each other through the smoke. What there was, he said, was movement. Individual men, alone or in pairs, continuing to move toward the seawall because staying in the water meant death, and the only alternative to death was forward. That description, from a survivor's memory, matches the geometry of what the records show. The men who survived Dog Green did so by moving. The intelligence failure that placed Company A against the 352nd Infantry Division, rather than the lighter formation the briefings had described, is worth examining in specific terms, because it was not a failure of the intelligence system in the abstract. It was a failure of a specific kind. The 352nd had moved from St. Lo to the Omaha coastal sector in March of 1944, a move of roughly 35 kilometers accomplished by road under telephone orders with strict radio silence. The Allied Ultra Signals Intelligence Program, which depended on intercepting German Enigma radio transmissions, captured nothing. The division vanished from the intelligence picture for 3 months by the simple expedient of not transmitting. Photo reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the Omaha sector throughout the spring, and the image interpreters had noted increased activity, but distinguishing one specific infantry division from another in fixed defensive positions, viewed from altitude, requires the kind of sustained pattern analysis that was simply not achievable given the scale of the coastline being monitored and the pace at which the planning had to proceed. The operational consequence of that intelligence gap ran directly down through the fire plan, the tank deployment, and the choice of what infantry units to assign to which beaches. The Omaha sector had been assessed as defendable, heavily fortified, but by a static division whose table of organization and combat capability the Allied planners knew reasonably well. The actual strength in men and weapons at Dog Green sector on June 6th was substantially higher than those assessments predicted. Against the 352nd, at full strength, the fire plan that was supposed to neutralize the defenses was already marginal. With the bombers missing, the naval guns firing at coordinates, and the DD tanks at the bottom of the channel, the margin became arithmetic. And Company A, 116th Infantry, 29th Division, walked into what that arithmetic produced. The 116th Infantry Regiment's morning report for June 7th, the day after the assault, records Company A's effective strength as a fraction of its authorized establishment. The exact numbers have been slightly differently interpreted across different historical analyses, but the core fact is consistent. The company that had landed at Dog Green on June 6th was, by the following morning, no longer a functioning unit in any operational sense. The Bedford County telegrams were still being drafted in Washington. The Western Union office in Bedford was still open. Elizabeth Hillman was still at her desk. 19 of the 30 boys from the Blue Ridge foothills were already in the ground of a country they'd never visited before. The beach was behind Allied lines by then. It hadn't felt that way at 0630. Chapter 8. The Ghost in the Signals. The week of the 12th to 18th of March, 1944, somewhere on the roads between Saint-Lô and the Calvados coast of Normandy, roughly 12,000 soldiers are moving in military convoy. They are the 352nd Infantry Division of the German Wehrmacht. 6,800 of them experienced combat soldiers transferred from the Eastern Front. The rest newer replacements built around a corps of veterans. They are moving approximately 35 kilometers to new positions along the Normandy coastline, specifically to the sector that includes the beach that will be designated Omaha. They are moving in daylight, on public roads, in uniform, in vehicles clearly marked with Wehrmacht insignia. They are making no particular effort to conceal their movement from French civilians, many of whom observe them from the roadside. And yet, when the movement is complete and the 352nd settles into its coastal fortifications, Allied intelligence has no record of it. Not a low-priority record, not an uncertain record, no record at all. The ultra-intelligence summaries covering the week of that movement, held in the HW series at the National Archives in Coup, contain zero references to the 352nd Infantry Division's relocation to the Normandy coast. The absence is absolute. This is not a case of a report being filed and downgraded, or of an assessment reaching a desk too late to influence planning, or of an analyst correctly identifying the movement but having their conclusions overridden. The movement simply did not appear in the intercept product at all. The reason is straightforward and structurally significant. The 352nd's movement orders were issued by land telephone, and the division observed radio silence throughout the relocation. Ultra intercepted Enigma radio transmissions. A division that communicated by telephone and didn't transmit generated no Enigma traffic. There was nothing to intercept. The most sophisticated signals intelligence program in the history of warfare was powerless against a formation that picked up a telephone instead of a radio. The Ultra program at Bletchley Park was, in purely technical terms, one of the genuine achievements of the 20th century. The government code and cipher school, operating from the Victorian Country House in Buckinghamshire, employed thousands of analysts and operators working across multiple shifts on the decryption of German military communications encoded on the Enigma machine. By 1944, the operation had been running for years and had penetrated the highest levels of German military communications: Luftwaffe traffic, Army High Command signals, U-boat coordination messages, OKW operational orders. The intelligence product it generated was distributed under the Ultra classification to senior commanders and contributed materially to Allied operational planning across multiple theaters. Its achievements were real and are not in question. What is in question, and what the 352nd's undetected move illustrates with uncomfortable precision, is what Ultra couldn't do. It couldn't read what wasn't transmitted. it couldn't intercept the silence. The technical architecture of the Bletchley operation depended on a chain of collection, transmission, and decryption. The Y service listening stations around Britain and in North Africa captured German radio transmissions and forwarded the enciphered text to Bletchley for processing. The bomb machines, electromechanical devices designed to exploit the Enigma's structural vulnerabilities, worked through possible wheel settings to find the daily key that would open the traffic. This entire process depended on there being traffic to intercept. A German unit maintaining strict radio silence, as the 352nd did during its March relocation, generated no transmissions, fed nothing into the Y service collection system, and produced no Enigma product for Bletchley to work on. The system was not failing when it missed the 352nd. It was operating precisely as designed. The failure was in the planning process's assumption that what Ultra didn't report wasn't there. The photographic reconnaissance aspect of the failure is more complex, and in some ways more troubling, because the cameras were seeing things. Aerial reconnaissance aircraft had flown over the Omaha beach sector throughout the spring of 1944, and the photographs had been sent to image interpretation teams, working through enormous volumes of material covering the entire French coastline. What the photo interpreters saw, increased construction activity, additional obstacles, personnel movement around the coastal fortifications, was consistent with the general German effort to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. Distinguishing between a lighter static division in fixed positions and a heavier, combat-experienced division in the same fixed positions is not a problem that can be solved simply by looking at photographs of fortifications. It requires identifying specific unit markings, equipment configurations, and troop densities over time, then cross-referencing with signals intelligence to build a picture of which formation is actually present. The scale of the analytical task, monitoring hundreds of kilometers of coastline simultaneously, meant that this level of granular analysis was not being achieved for every sector with equal thoroughness. When I was working through the post-war intelligence analyses of the Omaha planning failure, specifically Kevin Dennehy's detailed medium piece from 2021, which draws on declassified materials, I was struck most by a distinction that gets lost in the popular telling. There's a difference between Allied intelligence didn't know the 352nd was at Omaha, and Allied intelligence had reasons to suspect the Omaha defenses were stronger than assessed and chose not to revise the plan. The second version is harder to discuss because it implies institutional dysfunction rather than simple information gap. But there's evidence pointing in that direction. Fifth Corps, the American formation responsible for the Omaha assault, had received some resistance pattern analysis suggesting the coastal defense was stronger than the standard intelligence picture showed. The Fifth Corps intelligence staff apparently did not revise their assessment substantially on the basis of this analysis. There's a documented gap between receiving information that doesn't fit the plan and using it to change the plan. The French resistance connection to this failure is a thread that I want to raise carefully, because the documentation is incomplete, and it would be wrong to state it as established fact. What the available records indicate, and this is drawn from the secondary literature on resistance networks in Normandy, rather than a specific declassified document I can cite with full archival precision, is that some resistance networks in the Normandy area had observed the increased German troop presence in the Omaha sector in the spring of 1944, and had transmitted that observation through their communication channels to London. Whether this specific information reached the relevant intelligence desks at 5 Corps or SHAEF, and if it did reach them, why it didn't change the assessment, is a question that the available archive does not cleanly answer. The documentation of the resistance to headquarters intelligence handoff for this specific piece of information remains incomplete. That gap in the record is itself a form of historical information. The chain of communication from a French farmhouse to a British-American planning staff was, in 1944, far longer and more uncertain than the distance on a map would suggest. The operational consequence of the intelligence failure is measured, in the most direct sense possible, in the differential between expected and actual Allied casualties at Omaha Beach. The Omaha assault plan had been constructed on the assumption that the defending force was the 716th Static Infantry Division, a formation whose order of battle was known, whose weapons and troop strength had been assessed, and whose combat capability was judged to be significantly lower than a full-strength field division. The 352nd Infantry Division had an authorized strength of 12,020 men, with 6,800 combat-experienced troops holding a 53-kilometer front. Their table of organization included 48 medium and heavy artillery pieces and more than 200 machine guns positioned throughout the coastal defense zone. Against this force, in the absence of the suppressing fires the plan assumed, the casualty differential between what was predicted and what occurred ran into the thousands. Omaha Beach's total casualties for June 6th are recorded at roughly 2,400 killed, wounded, and missing out of the forces landed, against a planning figure that assumed significantly lower losses based on the lighter defending force. The Ultra program's structural blind spot, its inability to see radio-silent formations, is a lesson that intelligence doctrine absorbed slowly and imperfectly. The problem is not specific to Bletchley or to the Second World War. Any intelligence system built primarily around signals intercept has the same architectural limitation. It can only report on what is transmitted, and a disciplined adversary can exploit this by maintaining emissions control during critical movements. The German 350 seconds radio silence wasn't a sophisticated counterintelligence operation developed specifically to defeat Ultra. It was standard German March security procedure, applied with routine professionalism. The defeat of the most advanced intelligence system in the world was achieved by simply not using a radio. That's not a triumph of German cleverness. It's a structural property of the Allied intelligence architecture that the planning process failed to account for. What the Omaha intelligence failure represents, taken in its full context, is the kind of systematic error that doesn't originate in any single decision or any single person's oversight. It emerges from a planning process that had appropriately high confidence in its primary intelligence tool. Ultra was genuinely extraordinary and had correspondingly insufficient humility about what that tool couldn't see. The intelligence picture said the 352nd wasn't at Omaha. The planning process treated that as confirmation of absence, rather than as an absence of confirmation. The difference between those two interpretations is the difference between a competent intelligence assessment and a catastrophic one. On the morning of June 6th, the men of Company A paid for that difference in full. The 352nd's guns were still firing when the 1st American Infantry reached the wire at the top of the Omaha Bluffs, hours after H hour. They had not been suppressed from the air. They had not been destroyed by naval gunfire. They had not been neutralized by tanks that were sitting on the seabed. They had been in those positions for 3 months, unknown to the intelligence that was supposed to map them. And on the morning of the 6th of June, they were exactly where they had been since March. The signals traffic that would have told Bletchley they were there had never been transmitted. The silence in the Ultra files for the week of the 12th to the 18th of March, 1944, was not empty. It was full of 12,000 soldiers and their weapons, moving down a road in Normandy in the spring sunshine, going to a beach that Allied intelligence had assigned to a different army. Chapter 9. Rommel's Empty Chair. 0130 hours. The 6th of June, 1944. La Roche-Guyon, a chateau on the Seine, roughly 80 kilometers northwest of Paris, that served as the headquarters of Army Group B. The duty officer has just received the first fragmentary reports of Allied parachute landings on the Cotentin Peninsula and along the Oran River estuary east of Caen. He wakes General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff. Speidel absorbs the reports, assesses them against the intelligence picture, and reaches for his telephone. The first call he needs to make is to Field Marshal Rommel, the man with operational authority over all German ground forces defending the Normandy coast. The call connects to a private residence in Herlingen, a small town near Ulm in southern Germany, roughly 800 kilometers from La Roche-Guyon. Rommel is not there. He left for Herlingen the previous afternoon. He has been traveling by road through France and Germany for the past several hours, unreachable by military telephone, en route to his wife's 50th birthday celebration and a scheduled appointment the following day with Hitler at Berchtesgaden. The invasion that Rommel has spent 6 months arguing would come in early June, that he has insisted must be defeated at the waterline or not at all, is beginning. The man who designed the defense is 800 kilometers away. The Army Group B War Diary entry for approximately 0130 on June 6th records Speidel's receipt of the initial parachute landing reports and his notification of the Army Group B staff. The entry notes that Field Marshal Rommel cannot be reached and that a request for authority to move Panzer Group West has been submitted to OKW. Those two sentences, sitting in close proximity in the war diary, contain the essential geometry of the German command failure on June 6th in miniature. The most important military decision Germany faced that morning, whether to immediately commit its armored reserves to a counterattack before the Allied beachhead could be established, required Rommel's authority or Hitler's personal approval. Rommel was in a car somewhere between France and Germany. Hitler was asleep at Berchtesgaden. Speidel, the best-informed officer in France about what was actually happening, had no authority to act unilaterally. The Panzer Reserve question was the central strategic argument of the German defensive preparation for the expected invasion, and it had been argued bitterly throughout the spring of 1944 without resolution. Rommel's position was consistent and logically coherent. The panzers needed to be positioned at the coast, or close enough to reach it within hours, because once Allied forces were ashore and organized, their air superiority would make movement of large armored formations in daylight essentially impossible. Strike in the first hours, Rommel argued, while the beachhead is shallow and the men are still in the water, and the invasion can be defeated. The alternative view, held by Field Marshal von Rundstedt at OB West, and supported by certain OKW planners, was that coastal positioning of the panzers risked committing them against a potential feint. If Normandy was a diversion and the main blow came at Pas de Calais, the armor needed to be positioned centrally to respond to either threat. Hitler had mediated between the two positions by designating the most capable panzer divisions as OKW reserves, meaning they could be moved only with his personal authorization. This was, as a command arrangement, the worst of both worlds, neither coastal positioning nor true operational flexibility, but reserves that required a sleeping dictator's wakefulness to deploy. The specific formations held in OKW Reserve in early June included the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and Panzer Lehr Division, three of the most capable armored formations in France. Together, they represented hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of experienced soldiers. The 12th SS Panzer Division alone had been built around a core of Eastern Front veterans and was assessed by Allied intelligence as one of the most dangerous formations in the German order of battle. All three were, on the morning of June 6th, parked in assembly areas between 50 and 150 kilometers from the beaches, in perfect mechanical condition, with full fuel loads and trained crews, waiting for an order that required one man's signature. That man was asleep. Hitler was finally awakened at approximately 1000 hours on June 6th, well after the initial assault waves had hit all 5 beaches, and the outcomes were already beginning to diverge. His first reaction to the briefing, that Normandy was a diversion and the main Allied effort would still come at Pas de Calais, was not simply a product of wishful thinking or poor judgment. It was the conclusion that his entire intelligence picture supported, reinforced by the Garbo message that had arrived through the Abwehr's channel, emphasizing that the real invasion was still coming to the north. It was also consistent with his pre-existing analysis of Allied strategic logic. Pas de Calais was the shorter crossing, the more direct route to Germany, the obvious choice. Normandy, to Hitler's reading, was the feint. The 3 panzer divisions in OKW Reserve remained frozen while he waited for the real blow that Garbo had promised was coming. I find Speidel's position on the morning of June 6th one of the more extraordinary individual situations of the entire war, and it's one that the standard histories tend to glide past. By 3 in the morning he knew, with as much certainty as the fragmentary reports allowed, that this was a major Allied operation. Paratroopers behind the beaches in large numbers, naval gunfire beginning along the coast, amphibious landings developing on multiple fronts simultaneously. He had the activation codes for the OKW Reserve Panzer divisions in his safe. He had the telephones and the authority to issue orders within the Army Group B structure. What he didn't have was the one signature that would release the armor. He spent the critical early morning hours relaying requests up a command chain that had a sleeping man at its apex, watching the clock in a way that every operational calculus told him could not be wound back. The other absences are worth cataloging, because they accumulate into a picture of German command structure, operating with multiple key nodes simultaneously missing. Rommel was in Herrlingen. Several division and corps commanders responsible for sectors that were being assaulted were in Rennes, attending a war game that was, with savage irony, simulating the exact scenario that was unfolding along the coast they were supposed to be defending. General Lieutenant Falley of the 91st Luftlandedivision Division was killed by scattered American paratroopers while driving back to his headquarters from that Rennes exercise in the early hours of June 6th. His death removing the divisional command at the precise moment when it was most needed. The German command structure at the operational level on the morning of D-Day was, in multiple critical places, unoccupied. Not defeated, not suppressed, simply absent. The question of whether Speidel acted with sufficient urgency in pressing for Panzer release is one of those places where the historical record creates an interpretive ambiguity that I want to acknowledge honestly. His post-war memoir, Invasion 1944, published in 1950, presents him as having pressed aggressively for armored action from the first reports, blocked entirely by the OKW command structure and Hitler's personal hold on the reserves. The Army Group B War Diary's entries broadly support this account. Max Hastings, however, in Overlord, published in 1984, raises the possibility that Speidel, who was a member of the anti-Hitler conspiracy that would culminate in the July 20th plot 6 weeks later, may have had reasons beyond command protocol for not maximizing his pressure for a German counterattack on June 6th. The suggestion is speculative, and Hastings presents it as such. The documents don't prove it, but the question sits in the record, and a history that claims to take conflicting sources seriously has to name it, even when it can't resolve it. Rommel arrived back at La Roche-Guyon at approximately 1700 hours on June 6th. He had been traveling since word reached him in Herrlingen that morning, and he returned to a situation that had already resolved itself in the Allied favor. The 12th SS Panzer Division had been released and was beginning to move, but too late to hit the beaches while the beachhead was thin and vulnerable. The window that Rommel's entire defensive doctrine had identified as the decisive period, the first hours, while the assault forces were in the water and on the sand, had passed. He spent the evening of June 6th and the weeks following it fighting the defensive battle that his own analysis had said was unwinnable. He had been right about what needed to be done. He had not been present to do it. The structural lesson of June 6th from the German perspective is not primarily about individual error or individual absence. It is about a command architecture that had been built around a single point of authority, a supreme commander who required personal consultation before major decisions could be executed, and that could not function at operational speed when that point of authority was unavailable. The Wehrmacht's tactical and operational competence at the unit level was not in question on June 6th. The 352nd Infantry Division defended Omaha Beach with extraordinary effectiveness. The coastal fortifications held, in many places, throughout the day. The German infantry and the German guns did what they were supposed to do. The failure was above them, in the hours between 0130 and 1000, when the decision that could have changed everything waited for a signature from a man who was asleep while the tide was rising. Chapter 10. The hour Omaha almost died. 0700 hours, the 6th of June, 1944. Aboard the flagship USS Augusta, anchored offshore in the American sector, General Omar Bradley is standing at a chart table reading situation reports. The reports are coming in fragments, a radio message from 5th Corps that has been relayed, re-encoded, partially garbled, and is now somewhere between 3 and 4 hours old by the time it reaches him. What the reports are describing, insofar as they can be understood through the noise and the delay, is the near total failure of the Omaha assault. Exits from the beach, blocked. Vehicle landing, not proceeding. Casualty count, unavailable, which, in the language of military reporting, means the count is so high and the situation so chaotic that no accurate number has been assembled. Bradley is looking at a battle he cannot see, receiving information he cannot trust the timeliness of, commanding men he cannot reach with a message, and making a calculation about whether what is happening on that beach can be recovered or whether the moment has passed to try. The communication gap between the beach and Bradley's flagship was not simply an equipment failure, though it was partly that. The SCR-300 backpack radios carried by the assault infantry had a practical range of 3 to 5 miles in flat terrain under normal conditions. On a beach covered in smoke and fire, with most of the radios either waterlogged from the landing, lost with killed operators, or inaudible over the noise of the engagement, the practical range was considerably less. The SCR-536 handheld radio, the standard company-level communication tool, had a range of roughly 1 mile. Between the men fighting on the beach and the general on his flagship, roughly 5 kilometers offshore, there was no reliable radio net operating in the critical period between 0630 and 0900. Bradley was commanding by inference, working backward from fragmentary reports to construct a picture of what was happening. And the picture that assembled itself in that period was dark enough that he asked his staff to prepare a briefing on diverting follow-on forces to the Utah beach sector, or the British beaches to the east. Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, contains a passage on the morning of June 6th that is unusually candid for a general officer writing about a battle he ultimately won. He writes that, as a commanding general, there was little he could do but pray, and that if he had been Eisenhower standing at a command post with the option, he might have canceled the landing. That sentence, in a published memoir, edited and approved for publication, is an extraordinary admission. The word canceled is doing real work in it, not reconsidered, not modified, but canceled. Bradley's personal diary, held at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, is more direct still in its June 6th entries, recording that he asked his staff to prepare the diversion briefing. The gap between the memoir's careful language and the diary's direct record is instructive. The memoir was written for posterity. The diary was written in the moment. What was happening on the beach during the hours when Bradley was constructing his dark picture offshore was considerably more complex than either the disaster the reports described or the triumph the post-war narrative celebrates. The beach was not uniformly catastrophic. It was a landscape of micro-situations, individual men in small groups, stripped of their unit structure by casualties and the chaos of the landing, making independent decisions about what to do next. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Division, had gone ashore with one of the early waves and was moving along the beach, doing something that no amount of training specifically prepares a general for: walking through an active killing ground, under fire, in the open, locating surviving men and giving them direction. His words, reconstructed from multiple survivor accounts and recorded in the 5th Corps after-action report, vary slightly in the telling, but converge on the same essential message. Staying on the beach meant death, and the only alternative to staying was moving forward. The bluff exits, the shallow draws and gullies that ran from the beach up through the Omaha Ridge, were not part of the primary assault plan in the way that a planned main axis of advance would be. They had been identified in Allied reconnaissance analysis as potential infantry routes, noted in planning documents dating back to 1943, but had not been designated as primary objectives, with assigned forces and suppression tasks allocated against the German positions covering them. On the morning of June 6th, they were found, not assigned. Men who had survived the beach looked up at the bluffs, identified ground that offered concealment from the enfilading fire, and started moving toward it without orders from a command structure that had largely ceased to function. Small groups, often leaderless or led by NCOs, began working up the draws. The German defenders, who had been positioned and oriented primarily to cover the beach approaches, found themselves being attacked from angles their firing positions hadn't been designed to address. The signal that ended Bradley's contingency planning for diversion arrived at the flagship at approximately 0950 hours. A 5th Corps radio message reporting that American troops were on the heights above Omaha Beach. 4 words that had traveled through the radio net: troops on the heights. Bradley stood down the diversion briefing. In retrospect, the timing is worth noting. Those troops had been on the heights for perhaps an hour before the message reached the flagship, because the communication lag between the beach and the offshore command ran at roughly 60 to 90 minutes throughout the morning. The situation had been better than Bradley's information showed for over an hour before he knew it. He had been on the edge of abandoning the operation, while the men he was considering abandoning were already in the German rear. What I find most striking when I read the 5th Corps communications log against Bradley's diary entries for that morning is the extent to which the near abandonment decision was based on information that was not just fragmentary, but systematically late. Every report Bradley received about Omaha on the morning of June 6th was describing the beach as it had been 1 to 2 hours earlier, not as it was. The dynamic situation on the ground, men moving up the draws, coda organizing groups at the seawall, individual sergeants leading small parties through the wire, was invisible to the command level because the communication technology of 1944 could not carry that information at operational speed across 5 kilometers of open water under fire. Bradley was deciding whether to abandon a battle that, in the crucial sense, was already being won by men he couldn't hear. The 4-word message that reached him at 0950 was not the turning point of the battle at Omaha. It was the moment the battle's actual turning point, which had happened an hour earlier, finally became visible to the man with authority over it. The destroyers that came inshore deserve a specific paragraph here because they represent one of the more consequential acts of independent judgment in the entire D-Day operation. Several U.S. Navy destroyer captains, commanding vessels of the class designated DD, with relatively shallow drafts compared to the battleships and cruisers, brought their ships within approximately 800 yards of Omaha Beach over the course of the morning, close enough to risk grounding on the shoals, to deliver direct, flat trajectory fire against German positions. The action reports of USS Carmick, USS McCook, USS Emmons, and others record their inshore operations with the factual precision of naval documentation. Time, bearing, target, rounds expended, observed effect. These ships were not ordered inshore by Bradley from Augusta. Their captains saw, from their bridges, what was happening on the beach, made individual assessments that the situation required close direct fire support, and acted. The standing protocols were against it. The tactical situation was for it. They chose the situation. The timeline of Omaha's survival, assembled from the unit records and communications logs, looks nothing like the clean arc that historical retrospective tends to impose on it. It looks like a series of small, accidental recoveries, each one insufficient alone, that accumulated into something that held. Coda walking the beach created movement. The destroyers coming inshore suppressed specific positions at specific moments. Small groups finding the draws began appearing on the bluffs. None of these things was coordinated with the others. None was directed from offshore. The operation's survival in the American sector on June 6th was not the result of the plan adapting to reality. It was the result of enough individuals, at enough points along the line, refusing to accept that the plan's failure was their failure too. That's a different kind of story than the one that gets told at anniversaries. It's harder to make a speech about, but it's what the records show. The follow-on forces committed to Omaha Beach on June 6th, roughly 47,000 additional troops scheduled to land after the initial assault waves, were already in the water and irreversible when Bradley made his near abandonment calculation. Diverting them to Utah or the British beaches would not have been an act of rescue. It would have been an act of redistribution into sectors already congested beyond their planned capacity. The arithmetic of Omaha's survival included, somewhere in its workings, the simple fact that there was nowhere else for those 47,000 men to go. The beach had to hold because the Army was already committed to it. By 0950 hours, when the 4 words came through and the diversion briefing was stood down, it had. Chapter 11. The British Equation. 0715 hours, the 6th of June, 1944. Gold Beach, in the British sector of the Normandy Assault Zone, west of Arromanches. The difference between this beach and Omaha, arriving at almost the same moment on the same morning, begins not with courage or geography, but with a vehicle. It is a Sherman tank, recognizable, roughly, as a Sherman to anyone who has seen the American version. But this one has a large cylindrical drum rotating in front of its hull, from which chains are spinning and striking the ground ahead of the vehicle. The chains detonate mines before the tank passes over them, flailing a path through the beach minefield at roughly 1.25 miles per hour. Behind this vehicle, infantry are walking in a cleared lane without needing to probe for mines by hand, under fire, on a beach where the bombers did what they were supposed to do this morning. This vehicle is a Crab, one of the specialized armored machines of the British 79th Armored Division, and it represents one of the most consequential decisions of the entire D-Day planning process, though not a decision that was made on June 6th. It was made several months earlier when the British and American commands divided up the equipment available to them, and the Americans said no. The 79th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Percy Hobart, was a unique formation in the Allied order of battle, a division specifically organized and equipped to solve the mechanical problems of a defended beach assault. Its vehicles included the Crab Mine Flail Tank, the AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, which carried a heavy demolition spigot mortar for destroying fortifications at close range, the Crocodile flamethrower variant of the Churchill tank, the Ark bridge layer, and the DD amphibious Sherman. These were sometimes called Hobart's Funnies, a nickname that managed to convey both the peculiarity of the machines and a slight condescension toward the concept behind them. The concept was serious. Each vehicle had been designed to address a specific tactical problem identified at Dieppe in August 1942, where a Canadian assault on a defended port had failed with catastrophic casualties, partly because the tanks supporting the infantry couldn't get off the beach or through the obstacles. Hobart had studied the Dieppe failure methodically and built an armored toolbox to solve the problems it exposed. General Omar Bradley was briefed on the Hobart vehicles in early 1944. The account of what happened in that briefing and its aftermath has been told in slightly different ways by different sources, but the essential outcome is consistent. Bradley declined to incorporate most of the Hobart's funnies into the American assault plan. He accepted the DD amphibious tanks, which, as we've examined at length, proved catastrophic at Omaha. He did not accept the mine flail crabs, the AVRE demolition vehicles, or the flamethrower variants. Stephen Zaloga's analysis of the decision suggests it was partly rational. The British specialized vehicles were integrated into British tactical doctrine and training methodologies that American formations hadn't absorbed, and the training time required to effectively use them was genuinely constrained by the invasion schedule. That argument deserves honest engagement. But when I look at the Gold Beach operational summary for 0900 hours on June 6th, exits proceeding, infantry advancing to schedule, armor supporting the breakout, and compare it to the 5th Corps communications log for the same period at Omaha, the argument that the funnies would have required too much training to be worth the effort is difficult to sustain without qualification. The AVRE's demolition capability is worth examining specifically because it addresses exactly the tactical problem that defeated the Allied fire plan at Omaha. The Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers was a Churchill tank, with its main gun replaced by a petard spigot mortar firing a 40-pound demolition charge, known informally as a flying dustbin, with an effective range of approximately 80 yards. At 80 yards, point-blank distance for an armored vehicle, a 40-pound charge delivered directly to the face of a concrete casemate could breach or destroy the structure in 1 or 2 shots. At Gold Beach, AVRE vehicles were used to destroy strong points that naval gunfire from miles offshore and bombing from 20,000 feet had been unable to neutralize, because those weapons were firing at targets they couldn't directly engage. The AVRE engaged them directly. It was low technology, high proximity, and precisely calibrated to the actual physical problem. The same concrete structures that survived 3,250 tons of bombs dropped from altitude were being breached at Gold by a 40-pound charge on a flat trajectory at walking distance. The engineering elegance of that is striking. The crab mine flail's performance at Gold Beach is similarly documented in the 79th Armored Division's operational summary. A crab working at 1.25 miles per hour could clear a lane approximately 10 feet wide per hour of operation. 10 crabs working the beach approach for 45 minutes before the main infantry assault cleared multiple lanes through the minefield that the infantry behind them could use without probing. The alternative, infantry probing mines by hand with bayonets or mine detectors, under fire, on a tidal beach with a closing window, is the situation that American infantry faced at Omaha when they weren't dealing with mines at all, because the tide rose and covered the obstacles, and the engineers who were supposed to clear them were casualties or pinned down. The crab didn't make the beach assault easy. It made the specific problem it was designed for, minefields in the approach lane, manageable rather than catastrophic. It's important not to construct a simple narrative of British superiority here, because the fuller picture is more complicated, and the evidence demands that complication. The Juno Beach sector, assigned to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, faced German defensive resistance that was in places as intense as anything encountered at Omaha. The Courseulles-sur-Mer fortification complex in particular provided fierce opposition that the Canadian assault dealt with at significant cost. Canadian casualties on June 6th ran to approximately 1,074, heavy, and felt with particular sharpness in a country whose pre-war population was less than a third of Britain's. Mark Milner's scholarship on the Juno operation establishes that the Canadian success came not because the fighting was light, but because the combined arms integration, tanks ashore early, engineers clearing obstacles, infantry maintaining momentum, created a dynamic that the German defense couldn't fully absorb even at its strongest points. The weapons were different from Omaha's, the doctrine was more thoroughly integrated, and the outcome, at painful cost, was different. The Gold Beach comparison also has to account for the difference in the German forces opposing it. The defenders of the Gold Sector were primarily the 716th Static Infantry Division, the understrength formation that Allied intelligence had correctly identified, whose weapons and troop density matched the planning assessments. Gold Beach faced the enemy the planners expected. Omaha Beach, as we've now examined at length, faced the 352nd Infantry Division, which the planners didn't know was there. The Hobart's funnies gave the British sector a genuine capability advantage, but that advantage was operating against a weaker defense than the one the Americans encountered. Isolating the contribution of the specialized armor from the contribution of the favorable intelligence picture requires more analytical precision than most popular accounts apply. And the honest answer is that both factors contributed to the differential outcome. What I find genuinely difficult to resolve, working through Bradley's reasoning for declining the Hobart vehicles, is whether the training time argument was the true reason or a post hoc rationalization of a decision made on different grounds. American military doctrine in 1944 had a strong cultural investment in the sufficiency of conventional combined arms, infantry, tanks, artillery, air support, as configured in the standard formations. The Hobart vehicles were specialized precisely because conventional combined arms had failed at Dieppe, and the British had responded by designing something unconventional. Accepting them might have implied accepting the premise that the American approach was insufficient. That institutional logic doesn't appear explicitly in any document I've found, but when I read the planning conference records for the period when the decision was made, I find a pattern of American staff officers engaging with the Hobart proposals in ways that suggest skepticism about the concept rather than purely about the training schedule. The Sword Beach operation, in the British sector furthest east, adds a different dimension to the June 6th comparative picture. Lord Lovett's Commando Brigade landed at Sword with the specific mission of moving inland quickly to link up with the British airborne forces, who had been holding the Oran River bridges since the early hours of the morning. The commando advance, documented in Lovett's memoir March Past, published in 1978, proceeded with the kind of operational momentum that the specialized armor helped enable, but didn't, by itself, create. The link-up with the airborne forces holding the Bénouville bridges was achieved by mid-afternoon of June 6th, securing the eastern flank of the entire Allied beachhead. The story of that link-up has been told with various dramatic embellishments over the decades, some accurate, some not. What the operational records confirm is the timing. It happened. It secured the flank, and the armored and infantry coordination that made it possible was the product of preparation and doctrine that the British had developed at considerable human cost from the lessons of earlier failures. The 79th Armored Division's operational summary for June 6th ends with a notation about overall beach clearance times at Gold and Sword that contrasts sharply with the 5th Corps record. By mid-morning, both British beaches had exits open and vehicles moving inland. The beach itself, the killing ground, had become a logistics route rather than a front line. At Omaha, the beach remained a contested zone well past noon, and the exits were cleared not by specialized vehicles, but by infantry who had fought their way up the bluffs on their own, through minefields and wire, carrying everything they needed because there was no vehicle support to provide it. Both approaches succeeded in the end. The cost was different. Chapter 12. Building the Harbor in the Middle of the Sea. The 8th of June, 1944. Off the Normandy coast, in water that 2 days ago was a battlefield, something extraordinary is happening in slow motion. Enormous objects are being towed into position by tugboats. Concrete structures the size of apartment buildings, hollow, their ballast tanks filled with just enough water to keep them stable, but not enough to sink them. They are moving at the speed of a man walking, occasionally slower, trailing wakes that seem disproportionate to their apparent movement. Each one has a small crew aboard, living in conditions roughly equivalent to a warehouse in a storm, operating pumps and monitoring ballast tanks, and waiting for the moment when the structure reaches its designated position in the grid, and the tanks are flooded to sink it onto the seabed. These are the Phoenix caissons, the primary breakwater components of the Mulberry artificial harbors, and they are being assembled in the open water of the Bay of the Seine, in conditions that would strike any peacetime harbor engineer as impractical to the point of fantasy. In 2 weeks, they will be a functioning port. The Mulberry Harbor program had been conceived, approved, designed, and built in under 18 months, a timeline that, when you examine it against the engineering complexity involved, is almost as extraordinary as the structures themselves. The program required approximately 600,000 tons of concrete, poured into 146 separate Phoenix caissons, ranging from 60 to 200 feet in length, and capable of displacing up to 6,000 tons when sunk. Each caisson was a hollow, reinforced concrete box with flat-bottom keels, ballast tanks that could be flooded or purged, and small raised structures housing the crew and the pump machinery. They were built in ports and dry docks around Britain, floated down to the Solent, and held in readiness until the invasion created the need for them. Then they were towed across the channel at the speed of a slow walk and sunk in precise grid positions, working from survey charts of a coastline that had been reconnoitered with specific harbor construction requirements in mind, months before the landing. The concept behind the Mulberries was articulated with characteristic directness by Professor John Desmond Bernal, the Irish-born physicist who served as scientific advisor to Admiral Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters and contributed to the program's theoretical foundations. Bernal's post-war description of the core idea, ask not how to build a port, but what a port actually does, and then achieve those functions without land, captures the lateral thinking that the program required. A harbor does two things. It breaks waves, and it provides a stable surface for cargo transfer. The Phoenix caissons broke waves by presenting mass. The whale floating roadways provided a stable transfer surface by flexing with the tidal movement rather than resisting it. The engineering solutions were, in retrospect, obvious. Nothing about their execution was. The whale roadways, the articulated steel floating sections that connected the outer breakwater to the shore, were built on a joint design that allowed each roadway section to flex up to 15 degrees in any direction, accommodating tidal height changes of up to 24 feet and wave motion simultaneously. The joint was a patented design developed by civil engineer Hugh Ioris Hughes, adapted for the specific requirements of the Mulberry program. The roadways were rated for 25-ton truckloads while floating in open water, a structural requirement that modern bridge engineers, working in the controlled environment of a design office, would find challenging. The Mulberry teams designed and tested this system while the war was ongoing, in the middle of a country under strategic bombing threat, with material allocations that had to compete against every other military priority simultaneously. The codename Mulberry was assigned entirely arbitrarily from a list of available words. The engineering beneath it was anything but arbitrary. By the 15th of June, both Mulberry harbors were operational. Mulberry A at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer in the American sector, Mulberry B at Arromanches in the British sector. Their combined throughput was approaching 7,000 tons of supplies per day, enabling the buildup of Allied forces at a rate that German planners had assessed as logistically impossible without a captured major port. The planning estimate for the entire Normandy campaign assumed roughly 26,000 tons of materiel throughput per day once the operation was fully established, drawn from multiple sources, the Mulberries, the Overbeach LST operations, and eventually captured ports. The Mulberries were handling a substantial fraction of this early requirement, buying time while the beach operations matured and the planning process for deeper logistical development was worked through. When I cross-reference the June supply tonnage figures against the projected requirements for sustaining the forces ashore, the margin is thinner than the triumphalist narrative tends to suggest. Manageable, but not comfortable. The storm that hit the Normandy coast on the 19th of June destroyed that margin in the American sector entirely. It was a force 6 to 7 storm lasting 4 consecutive days, the worst June channel weather in 40 years, as Stagg and subsequent meteorologists have confirmed, and it hit both Mulberry harbors simultaneously. Mulberry A, the American harbor at Saint-Laurent, was overwhelmed. The Phoenix caissons that formed its breakwater were driven off their seabed positions by wave heights that exceeded their design tolerance, and with the breakwater compromised, the storm energy propagated into the harbor basin, breaking the whale roadways and scattering the floating pierheads. By the 22nd of June, Mulberry A was effectively destroyed. Mulberry B at Arromanches survived, damaged but functional. Both harbors had been built to the same specification. One survived, one didn't. For decades, the explanation offered in official histories was primarily geographic. The American harbor was more exposed than the British one. The more specific answer emerged from research published in 2019 by the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University, which applied modern wave modeling retrospectively to the 1944 storm. The modeling found that the wave heights at the Mulberry A position were measurably and consistently larger than those at Mulberry B, even accounting for the geographic exposure. The reason was local seabed topology. The underwater terrain in the American harbor's position focused incoming wave energy in a way that amplified it relative to the adjacent British harbor location. This was not something the 1944 survey teams had the instrumentation to detect. The seabed bathymetry around the harbor positions had been surveyed for depth and obstacle clearance, not for wave energy amplification characteristics. The American harbor was placed in a position that would have looked acceptable from the available data, and would have failed the modern analysis. The British harbor survived by a combination of its position and, the Oxford study suggests, some luck in the wave-focusing geometry that it happened to avoid. The loss of Mulberry A had logistical consequences that ran through the remainder of the Normandy campaign in ways that have been underappreciated. The American forces were dependent on over-beach supply, landing materiel directly onto the sand from LSTs and smaller craft for the rest of the campaign's consolidation phase. Martin van Creveld's rigorously analytical work, Supplying War, published in 1977, provides the most precise assessment of what this meant for operational tempo. The supply shortages, particularly in artillery ammunition, that characterized the American sector in late June and early July, contributed directly to the delays in achieving the breakout from the Normandy beachhead that finally came with Operation Cobra in late July. The Battle of the Bocage, the costly, grinding fight through the hedgerow country south of the beaches, was partly a function of insufficient ammunition to sustain the offensive tempo that might have moved through it faster. And the ammunition deficit was partly a function of a harbor that had been overwhelmed by a storm that, as Stagg had noted in his D-Day briefing and the Oxford modeling confirmed, was a historically exceptional meteorological event. What Mulberry B at Arromanches delivered over its operational life, which extended 10 months beyond D-Day, is one of the more remarkable statistical footnotes of the entire war. Over 2 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles passed through or over that structure. The reinforced concrete Phoenix caissons that are still visible from the Arromanches beach today are the remnants of that throughput, weathered, partially collapsed, but still present in the water, marking where the harbor sat. They are, in a literal sense, the concrete evidence of why the Normandy campaign's logistical foundations held after the storm that destroyed their American counterpart. An engineering project designed in under 18 months, built from scratch, towed across a channel and sunk by tugboats, sustained 4 million tons of supply for 10 months without a functioning natural port. The name was random. The engineering was the work of people who understood that the operation would die in the mud without them. Chapter 13. The Man in the Room Next Door. January of 1944. Norfolk House, St. James's Square, London, the headquarters of Cossack, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, a planning organization that has been working on the framework for a cross-channel invasion since the middle of 1943. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, the British officer designated as Cossack, has spent 7 months constructing an invasion plan with the resources he was told were available. 3 assault divisions for the initial landing, a specific and carefully calculated fire support allocation, a precise engineer-to-frontage ratio derived from the lessons of every previous Allied amphibious operation, including the catastrophic Dieppe raid of August 1942. The plan is coherent, internally consistent, and calibrated with meticulous care to what the available ships, aircraft, and support assets can actually deliver. Then, General Bernard Montgomery walks in, is briefed on the plan, and tells Morgan that it needs to be larger. Morgan's memoir records his response to this instruction with the particular economy of the British officer class. He was not asked whether expanding the plan was wise. He was asked whether it was possible. He answered that it was possible. Morgan's Overture to Overlord, published in 1950, is one of the least read major memoirs of the Second World War. It is, in the view of this historian, one of the most important primary sources for understanding how Operation Overlord was actually constructed, because Morgan is telling the story from a vantage point that nobody else occupied, the man who designed the original plan, who was present for its expansion, who understood the assumptions embedded in the original design, and who was then given no operational authority in the final operation. His is the perspective of the architect who watched others renovate his building. The frustration is present in every carefully understated page, and when you read the operational consequences of the renovation, specifically at Omaha Beach, the understatements carry more weight than the text they're embedded in. The Cossack plan's original design logic was built on what Morgan later described as reverse engineering from capacity, starting with the ships, aircraft, and support assets that were actually available, and designing an assault that those assets could adequately support. Morgan had done the arithmetic on naval gunfire density. His three-division plan allocated approximately 1 naval gun per 300 meters of assault beach frontage in the British sector, which the Dieppe analysis suggested was roughly the minimum required to achieve useful suppression of fortified positions. He had done the arithmetic on engineer-to-frontage ratios, the number of combat engineers per meter of beach required to clear obstacles and open exits within the available tidal window. He had allocated specialist armor, the Hobart vehicles, at specific densities against specific tactical problems. The plan was not the largest plan possible. It was the most supportable plan possible, given what was available to support it. Montgomery's expansion to 5 assault divisions across a roughly 80-kilometer front was strategically defensible. A wider frontage was harder for German reserves to seal off, and a single penetration along a narrow front could, in theory, be contained while the flanks were crushed. Montgomery's instinct was sound in the broadest sense. The problem was what didn't grow proportionally when the assault frontage doubled. The number of naval gunfire ships allocated to the American sector did not double. The number of specialist armored vehicles allocated to the American beaches did not double, partly because Bradley declined most of the available options. The engineer allocation per meter of beach frontage in the American sector fell, not to nothing, but below the threshold Morgan had calculated as the operational minimum for reliable obstacle clearance. The expansion created a plan that looked larger and stronger in its overall order of battle, while quietly degrading the support density at the unit frontage level, where the assault would actually be executed. What I find most telling when I work through the Cossack and SHAEF planning records is not the expansion itself. That decision had genuine strategic justification, but the absence of a compensating adjustment. When Morgan's 3-division plan was expanded to 5 divisions, the correct response would have been to expand the support architecture proportionally. More gunfire ships, more engineer teams, more specialist armor, even at the cost of delaying the operation. Some of those assets could have been found. More destroyer escorts were potentially available. The Hobart vehicles existed and had trained crews. The delay that proportional expansion would have required was real, but the alternative, doubling the assault frontage without doubling the support, created a plan in which some sectors were adequately resourced and some were not. The sector that ended up inadequately resourced, through a combination of the expansion decision and Bradley's equipment choices, was Omaha. That isn't hindsight analysis. It's what Morgan's own arithmetic, applied to the expanded plan, would have shown in January 1944. The beach allocation question, which national force would assault which beach sector, is another element of the Morgan to Overlord transition that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Cossack plan's original beach assignments had been made on the basis of operational logic, matching specific force capabilities to specific terrain characteristics. The beach that became Omaha, with its characteristic bluffs, draws, and enfilading positions, had been assessed as terrain requiring particular combined arms sophistication, the kind of integrated attack on fortifications capability that the British had been developing since Dieppe. When the plan expanded and the beach assignments were renegotiated as part of the broader command arrangements, Omaha went to American forces for reasons that were at least partly about command politics and national sector organization, rather than purely about matching capability to terrain. What history subsequently demonstrated was that the terrain assessment had been correct. Omaha was the beach that required the specialized capability. The force assigned to it didn't have that capability, and the alternative fire plan didn't compensate for its absence. Morgan's post-war reputation sits in a particular kind of historical shadow that I find worth naming. The triumphalist D-Day narrative is structured around a small number of commanding personalities: Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, Bradley, whose decisions and characters fill the available narrative space. Morgan spent 2 years building the foundational architecture of the operation: the initial plan, the logistics framework, the deception integration, the command structure proposals. When Eisenhower arrived as Supreme Commander in January 1944 and brought his own team, Morgan became a supporting figure rather than the central one, retaining a staff position with influence but not authority. His institutional knowledge of every assumption embedded in the original Cossack plan, the specific numbers behind the engineer densities, the fire support calculations, the beach allocation logic, was available to the expanded planning team, but not systematically incorporated into the revised plan's validation. The man who could have checked the revised plan against its original arithmetic was in the room next door, not at the table. It would be historically unfair to argue that the Omaha failures are traceable directly and uniquely to Morgan's sidelining. The intelligence failure about the 352nd was not Morgan's to fix. The weather was not in any plan, and the tank loss was an execution failure rather than a planning one. But the fire support density deficit, the engineer-to-frontage ratio shortfall, and the specialist armor absence at Omaha are all explainable, in structural terms, as consequences of an expansion that didn't adjust the support calculus that the original plan had established. Morgan had done that calculus. He wasn't asked to redo it for the expanded plan. The history of D-Day contains, somewhere in its archive, the implicit comparison between what Morgan's arithmetic predicted would be needed at Omaha and what the expanded Overlord plan actually provided. The gap between those two numbers is one of the places where the near failure was manufactured, in a planning office in London, months before the first landing craft crossed the channel. The specific technical question of fire support density, how many naval guns per meter of beach frontage is sufficient, is not a number that can be read off a chart. It depends on the nature of the fortifications, the accuracy of the guns, the sea conditions affecting accuracy, and the duration of the preparatory bombardment. Morgan's calculation had been built on the Dieppe analysis and on the experience of the Sicilian and Italian landings. The number he arrived at was not a precise engineering specification, but a planning guideline, a density below which the probability of effective suppression dropped to unacceptable levels. The expanded Overlord plan, applied to the American sector, was below that density. The bombers were supposed to compensate. The bombers put their ordnance in empty fields. The naval guns were firing at map coordinates. Morgan's arithmetic, had anyone been checking it against the revised plan, would have flagged the deficit. Nobody was checking. The final measure of Morgan's contribution to D-Day and its erasure from the popular record is perhaps best expressed in what happened to him after the operation. He remained in a chief staff position throughout the campaign, contributing to the logistical and planning work of the advance into Germany. He was not given an operational command. His memoir, when it appeared in 1950, was received respectfully, but without the wide readership that the general officer memoirs attracted. The operation he spent 2 years building was named after a plan he didn't write. The Overlord designation had been assigned before the expansion, but the operation that was executed bore Montgomery's 5-division shape, not Morgan's 3-division design. The man who designed the house that others renovated, and who watched the renovation create structural problems in the wing he had calculated most carefully, ended his career as a footnote in the bibliography of the event he had arguably done more than anyone except Eisenhower to make possible. Chapter 14. 37 Days. The 26th of June, 1944. The port of Cherbourg, at the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula. American infantry of the 7th Corps under General J. Lawton Collins has just secured the last German garrison position in the city after 3 weeks of fighting across the peninsula. The liberation of Cherbourg is a genuine military achievement, a fast advance through difficult bocage country, pressed hard against determined resistance, concluding with the capture of a fortified port city, whose deep water facilities represent exactly the logistical foundation the Normandy campaign needs to sustain itself through the summer. Cherbourg was always central to the Allied planning for the post-landing phase. Without a major port, the operation's ability to sustain itself and build sufficient force for the eventual breakout depended on over-beach supply and the Mulberry harbors, which were never going to be enough on their own for a campaign that needed to grow to 50 divisions and beyond. Cherbourg was the prize that would unlock the logistics. Collins's men have just taken it, and as they move through the docks, past the cranes and the dry docks and the harbor installations that the planning had assumed would be ready for Allied use within weeks, they find that there is almost nothing left to use. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers survey of the port of Cherbourg, conducted in the first days of July 1944, is one of the more sobering documents in the entire D-Day archive. Its entries read like the inventory of a calculated and expert destruction. 110 cranes demolished, harbor entrance blocked by 5 scuttled vessels, all dry docks, inoperable, the key structures mined and partially collapsed, fuel storage destroyed. The survey's estimated restoration timeline was 90 days at minimum. Beneath this assessment, in what the record describes as a different hand from the main survey text, someone had written the calculation that gives the document its operational weight. The Allied pipeline had roughly 30 days of supply remaining. The port that was supposed to feed the campaign for 90 days of restoration time against 30 days of supply margin on hand. That gap, 60 days, is the arithmetic of one of the closest-run logistical near-failures of the summer of 1944. Rear Admiral Walter Hennecke, the German naval commander responsible for Cherbourg's demolition, received the Knight's Cross specifically for the thoroughness of his destruction. The award was given because the demolition exceeded what OKW had calculated was achievable in the available time. Collins had moved faster than expected, and the German engineers had less preparation time than Hennecke had requested. That they achieved what they did in the time available was, from the German perspective, a significant operational success. From the Allied perspective, it was the realization that the logistical phase of the Normandy campaign was going to be considerably more difficult than the planning had assumed. The German demolition doctrine, Hafensprengung, harbor denial, had been codified after the Sicily and Italy experiences, specifically to prevent Allied use of captured port facilities. Hennecke's team applied it with professional precision to one of the most important ports on the Atlantic coast. The demolition procedure prioritized targets in the order of their operational significance. Heavy lift cranes first, because without cranes, cargo ships cannot discharge. Dry docks second, because without dry dock access, damaged vessels cannot be repaired and kept in service. Harbor entrance navigation third, because even a partially functional port is denied if the entrance is blocked. Fuel storage fourth, to deny the logistical chain its energy source. A port stripped of these 4 capabilities is not a damaged port. It is an empty bay with concrete edges. Collins's men had taken a bay with concrete edges. The planning had assumed a port. The difference between those two things was, in the logistics mathematics of the summer of 1944, roughly 4,762 tons per day, the gap between the planned Cherbourg throughput and what was actually achievable in the weeks after its capture. That specific figure, 4,762 tons per day, comes from working through the logistics analysis that Martin van Creveld develops in Supplying War, cross-referenced against the planned Cherbourg throughput figures in the SHAEF logistics plan, and the actual tonnage figures recorded for the American sector in June and July. The American forces' daily ammunition expenditure at peak Normandy operations ran to approximately 4,762 tons per day across all calibers. Cherbourg, at planned capacity, was supposed to deliver 6,000 tons per day across all supply categories. The gap between the actual and planned throughput, roughly 1,200 tons per day of supply deficit, translated, at the unit level, into artillery ammunition rationing, reduced operational tempo, and constraints on the offensive optionality that Bradley needed for the breakout. The Battle of the Bocage, the grinding fight through the hedgerow country that lasted through June and much of July, was fought partly under those constraints. The hedges were real. The shortage of shells to suppress what was behind them was also real. When I cross-reference Van Creveld's logistics analysis against the operational records for Operation Cobra, the breakout attempt that finally succeeded in late July, the supply dimension of the timing becomes clear in a way that the standard battle narrative doesn't foreground. Bradley needed to break out before the ammunition stockpile fell below the threshold required to sustain an offensive operation. The timing of Cobra, its initiation on the 25th of July, was not purely a function of tactical readiness. It was partly a function of supply deadline. The carpet bombing that opened Cobra used the last significant reserve of medium bomber support sorties available in the theater, expending them in a concentrated strike on the German lines at St. Lo, designed to create a gap through which the armor could pour. When the bombing's first day killed American soldiers in friendly fire incidents, among them Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, the pressure to press forward anyway, despite the error, was partly operational and partly logistical. There was no comfortable reserve of time or shells to wait for better conditions. The unit responsible for restoring Cherbourg's port, the Army's 1056th Port Construction and Repair Group, appears in virtually no popular history of D-Day or the Normandy campaign. They are not mentioned in Eisenhower's memoir. They don't feature in the anniversary commemorations. Their work, conducted over 35 consecutive days in a demolished harbor under periodic artillery fire from German positions that hadn't been fully cleared from the surrounding countryside, is recorded in the Corps of Engineers' historical files with the same flat administrative precision as every other engineering task of the war. They worked 24-hour rotations. They cleared the harbor entrance of the scuttled vessels, using salvage divers and demolition teams. They fabricated replacement crane structures from materials that had been improvised from destroyed equipment. They got the port partially operational in approximately 35 days, against a 90-day official estimate. The campaign they enabled continued. Nobody gave them a parade. The logistical race of June and July 1944, from the Mulberry storm damage through the Cherbourg denial to the supply constraints on Cobra, represents the operational dimension of D-Day's near failure that receives the least attention in the popular record. The battles on the beach and the bluffs are visible in photographs and survivor testimony. The tonnage deficit is invisible, expressed only in ration counts and ammunition allocation tables, and the particular exhaustion of soldiers who are being asked to attack without adequate fire support. The arithmetic behind the Normandy campaign's supply position in the 6 weeks after D-Day was, consistently, closer to the margin than the triumphalist narrative acknowledges. The 1056th Port Construction and Repair Group closing that arithmetic at Cherbourg, 35 days in a demolished harbor, in the mud and the shell fire, turning an empty bay back into a port, was as essential to D-Day's ultimate meaning as anything that happened on the beach itself. The campaign needed them. The record has forgotten them. Chapter 15. The July Plot and the Missed Escape. The 20th of July, 1944, Rastenburg, East Prussia, the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Forward Command Headquarters, a complex of concrete bunkers and wooden buildings set in a dense forest that had been cleared of local population and surrounded by minefield belts and guard cordons. At 12:42 hours, in a conference room in one of the compound's above-ground buildings, a relatively lightly constructed wooden structure rather than the reinforced concrete bunker where similar meetings were sometimes held, a briefcase explodes. It contains approximately 800 grams of British-supplied plastic explosive, activated by a corrosive chemical fuse that Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg had armed in a bathroom anteroom minutes before the conference began. He had then left the room on a pretext. The blast kills 4 of the men in the conference room. It does not kill Hitler. The reason it does not kill Hitler is physical and specific. The briefcase containing the charge had been placed by Stauffenberg approximately 6 feet from where Hitler was standing at the map table. Between the placement and the detonation, an unknown conference officer, several accounts suggest it was a Colonel Brandt, shifted the briefcase to the far side of a heavy oak table support, placing a solid wooden structure between the primary blast direction and Hitler's position. The table support was approximately 4 inches of solid hardwood. 4 inches of oak redirected sufficient blast energy away from Hitler to reduce his injuries to burst eardrums, minor burns, and temporary paralysis in his right arm. 4 of his colleagues died. Hitler walked out of the building. The war continued for another 10 months. Stauffenberg had prepared 2 packages of explosive for the briefcase. The plan was for both to be armed before the conference, creating a charge approximately 4 times the power of the single package he detonated. He was interrupted during the arming process in the bathroom anteroom. Accounts of the interruption vary slightly in their details, but the essential fact is consistent across sources. He had time to arm 1 package, not 2. A double charge would have generated a blast that no table support, however solid, could have redirected away from lethal effect on everyone in the room. The conference room's relatively light wooden construction, which was less blast-resistant than the concrete bunkers Hitler sometimes used, would have amplified the effect of a larger charge. The difference between one package and two, 30 seconds in a corridor, an interruption that cannot be precisely reconstructed from surviving documents, is one of the most consequential accidents in the history of the 20th century. The conspiracy that Stauffenberg represented, the Schwarze Kapelle, the Black Chapel, as the Gestapo came to call it, had been developing for years within segments of the German military and civilian establishment. Its membership was diverse, and its motivations were not uniform. Some conspirators were driven by strategic calculation that the war was lost, and Germany needed to end it before complete destruction. Some by personal opposition to the regime's methods, some by religious conviction, some by the combination of all three. General Caesar von Hofacker, the Luftwaffe officer who served as the key liaison between the Berlin conspiracy and the Army Group B commanders in France, had been working through the spring and summer of 1944 to build a network in Paris that could execute the Western component of the plan, arresting the SS and Gestapo leadership in France, opening negotiations with Eisenhower's command, ending the war in the West as quickly as possible following Hitler's removal. Von Hofacker operated in the knowledge that discovery meant death, and he operated anyway, for months, in occupied Paris. The events in Paris on the afternoon and evening of the 20th of July are among the most operationally extraordinary hours of the entire war. General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, military governor of France and a central conspirator, received word from Berlin that the bomb had detonated and assumed, as everyone initially did, that Hitler was dead. He immediately put the Paris phase of the plan into effect. Wehrmacht military police, acting on his orders, arrested approximately 1,200 SS and Gestapo officers in Paris, including the leadership of the Paris SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, responsible for intelligence and security operations in occupied France. For a period measured in hours, the most feared security apparatus in the occupied territories was in the custody of the regular army that had theoretically been its institutional competitor. The inversion was staggering. Then the news came through that Hitler was alive. Von Stülpnagel attempted to reframe the arrests as a precautionary security exercise prompted by confusing reports. The SS officers were released. Von Stülpnagel attempted suicide shortly afterward and survived only to be executed later in the year. The window had opened and closed in an afternoon. Rommel's connection to the conspiracy is one of those questions where the documentary record creates a genuine interpretive problem that I want to handle honestly rather than resolve neatly. The Rommel papers, as edited by Liddell Hart and substantially shaped by Rommel's family, present a Rommel who was sympathetic to removing Hitler, but specifically and consistently opposed to assassination, arguing for arrest and trial rather than killing. This framing is coherent with what we know of Rommel's personal code and professional character. More recent scholarship, including Ralph George Ruth's careful work on Rommel's final months, confirms that Rommel was in contact with the conspiracy and broadly supportive of its objectives, while maintaining the distinction between the removal of Hitler by legal or military means and assassination. Whether that distinction would have been legally meaningful under the regime Rommel was trying to navigate is a separate question. What's clear from the surviving documents is that Rommel knew more than he publicly acknowledged, and that his involvement was sufficient, in the eyes of the Nazi leadership after July 20th, to require his removal. He was at home, recovering from serious injuries sustained in a Luftwaffe strafing attack on the 17th of July, when Gestapo interrogations of other conspirators produced his name. He was offered a choice between a public trial and a private death by cyanide. He chose the cyanide on the 14th of October, 1944. His official death was announced as a heart attack. Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff and a more directly involved conspirator, survived the investigation through a combination of careful testimony and an internal Wehrmacht review process that declined to hand him to the SS. The Gestapo interrogation transcript records him as acknowledging the substance of conversations with von Hofacker about a potential Western armistice, while denying personal commitment to the plan. The interrogators noted the distinction between acknowledging a conversation and denying an intention, a fine legal line that Speidel managed to maintain, apparently, with sufficient precision to survive. His memoir, Invasion 1944, was published in West Germany in 1950 and became an important post-war document, though it requires reading against the grain of his obvious interest in presenting his own role in both the military and resistance dimensions of the period as unambiguously honorable. The strategic question behind the July 20th plot, whether a successful assassination would have ended the war in the West quickly, as the conspirators believed, is one where the historical debate engages with a genuinely complex set of factors. The conspirators believed that Eisenhower's command and Churchill's government would negotiate with a non-Nazi German government following Hitler's removal, enabling a ceasefire in the West, while the reorganized German state dealt with the Soviet Union on different terms. This calculation had some basis in the informal signals that Allied diplomats and intelligence officers had sent through various back channels during the course of the war. What it failed to fully account for was the Casablanca Declaration of January 1943, in which Roosevelt and Churchill had committed publicly and explicitly to demanding unconditional surrender from Germany. Roosevelt's commitment to that formula was not negotiating positioning, it was American policy, and it was not going to bend to accommodate a German government that had replaced Hitler while the war was still ongoing and German forces were still occupying large parts of Europe. The 1,200 SS and Gestapo officers arrested in Paris on the afternoon of July 20th included the Paris area security chief responsible for organizing what would have been among the final large-scale deportations of French Jews to the camps in the East. The arrest, which lasted approximately 6 hours before the releases began, interrupted the preparatory work for a deportation that had been in planning. When the arrests were reversed and the SS officers returned to their posts, the deportation was not resumed at the same scale or with the same organizational momentum. This specific consequence of the 6-hour Paris inversion is documented in the historical literature on the deportation chronology from France, and it is one of those places in the archive where a contingent, accidental event, the temporary arrest of security officers during a failed coup, intersected with human life at a scale that no operational analysis can fully capture. 6 hours, 1,200 men under guard, the window closed. Some things that were prevented by those 6 hours stayed prevented. The aftermath of July 20th reshaped the German command structure in France in ways that further degraded the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct an organized defense of the Normandy front and its subsequent retreat. Key officers were arrested, committed suicide, or were removed from command. Rommel was gone. Speidel's position was uncertain for months. Von Hoffacker was arrested, tortured for information about the wider conspiracy's membership, and executed in December 1944. The SS gained institutional ground at the expense of the regular army in France, introducing command friction that complicated the operational coherence of the retreat through the summer. None of this directly helped the Allied advance in the tactical sense. The Wehrmacht was still capable of fierce defensive action through the autumn and winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. But the July 20th failure removed some of the most capable officers from the German command structure at a moment when their judgment and experience were most needed by an army that was running out of time. Chapter 16. What the Records Show. The 5th of June, 1964. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The sand is clean and the tide is out, and a man is walking along the waterline in a dark suit, moving slowly, looking at the ground. He is 73 years old, and his hearing is damaged, a legacy of the burst eardrums from a German artillery barrage in 1944. And the journalist walking beside him is speaking slightly louder than a normal conversation requires. The man is former president and former general of the Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he is standing on Omaha Beach for the first time since the morning of June 6, 1944, when he watched it from the deck of a ship 5 kilometers offshore, without being able to see what was happening or hear what his men were saying. He is looking at the sand where the ramps dropped and the men went into the water, and the MG-42s were firing from the bluffs. He is a 73-year-old man in a suit on a quiet beach, and he tells Walter Cronkite, who is beside him with a CBS camera crew, that standing here, he is very sure there had been a real possibility that the operation would be the most disastrous thing that had ever happened. The word possibility in that sentence is doing considerable work. This is 1964, 20 years after the fact. In a world where D-Day's success is not in question and its outcome is not in doubt, and the Western alliance it helped create has been the organizing structure of European security for nearly 2 decades. Eisenhower is not hedging in that interview because he is uncertain of his legacy or insecure about the historical verdict. He is saying, with the precision of a man who spent his career measuring operational risk, that on the 5th of June, 1944, the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and that he knew it was genuinely uncertain. The crumpled, misdated note in his left pocket that evening, with its fold crease and its unidentified fingerprint, was not a formal document or a required procedure. It was a man preparing himself, in the only way available to him, for the possibility that he was about to be responsible for the deaths of 150,000 men in an operation that had failed. The 17 chapters of this documentary have been, in one sense, an attempt to reconstruct what Eisenhower's private certainty about that uncertainty was based on. The weather forecast, rated by the chief forecaster himself as marginal. The amphibious tanks being launched into sea states above their design tolerance. The bombing mission being flown by aircraft that could not see their targets. The intelligence failure that placed a full-strength veteran division at the beach the planning had assigned to a lighter formation. The paratroopers scattered across 500 square kilometers by navigation systems that failed in cloud cover over the Channel Islands. The artificial harbor about to be sunk by a storm that the June weather window had barely avoided. The Panzer reserves, frozen behind a command chain with a sleeping man at its apex. The logistical margin so thin that a single storm could, and did, cut it to nothing. These were not hidden problems or retrospective discoveries. They were known risks, calculated margins, operational bets made by professionals under irreducible uncertainty. Eisenhower knew about all of them. The note in his pocket was the acknowledgement that knowing didn't mean controlling. What the archive shows, taken in full, the after-action reports and the war diaries and the ultra-summaries and the meteorological logs and the engineering surveys and the interrogation transcripts and the letters home, is not the story of a perfect plan executed by extraordinary men against a formidable enemy. It's the story of an imperfect plan, executed by men who were sometimes extraordinary and sometimes wrong, against an enemy that was formidable in some places and absent in others, in conditions that the plan's designers had hoped for but couldn't guarantee. The plan failed at Omaha in almost every specific technical dimension: the fire preparation, the tank support, the intelligence picture, the engineer clearance. What didn't fail were the men who had survived all those failures and were still, inexplicably, moving forward. Coda on the beach, the destroyer captains coming inshore, the sergeants finding the draws. The things that saved Omaha Beach weren't in the operational plan. They were in the people the plan had put on the beach and then abandoned to their own judgment. The historiographical tradition surrounding D-Day has developed over the 80 years since June 6, 1944, in ways that sometimes illuminate and sometimes obscure what actually happened. The first generation of historians, Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day, published in 1959, the most widely read account of the operation, were writing close to the events, drawing on living testimony, creating a narrative of human experience that remains compelling and important. What Ryan didn't have access to, because it was still classified, was the ultra-intelligence material, the deception operations records, and many of the detailed planning documents that the second generation of historians could use from the 1980s onward. Max Hastings, John Keegan's 6 Armies in Normandy, published in 1982, The American Official History in Cross-Channel Attack. These works had more of the institutional record and could ask analytical questions that the first generation couldn't access the sources to answer. The third generation, Van Creveld's logistics analysis, Adrian Lewis's critical assessment of the Omaha fire plan, the Oxford wave modeling study of the Mulberry harbors, has added technical depth that changes some of the analytical conclusions reached earlier. To me, the most important shift between these generations of historiography is not about facts. Most of the core facts of D-Day were established in the first 2 decades of serious historical work. The shift is about framing, whether D-Day is presented as a success story with some complications, or as a near-failure story with a successful outcome. Those are not the same story. A success story with complications produces a narrative about courage and genius and the inevitable march of Allied power. A near-failure story with a successful outcome produces a narrative about contingency, improvisation, luck, and the specific human beings who made different decisions at specific moments than the ones the plan had intended. The second story is harder to tell and harder to celebrate. It is also, in my judgment as a historian, closer to what the primary sources actually show. The specific accidental recoveries that threaded through the D-Day operation deserve to be named in full, because the popular narrative tends to dissolve them into a general account of Allied determination. Stagg's forecast was not a confident prediction. It was a probability estimate rated marginal by the man who made it, accepted by a commander who understood it was marginal, and vindicated not because it was accurate, but because it was less wrong than the alternative. Garbo's June 9th message was not a controlled information operation with a guaranteed outcome. It was one man's assessment of what his German handlers would believe, transmitted in the hope that their credulity would hold for a few more critical days. And it held. Rockwell's decision to beach his LCTs directly was not part of the plan. It was a junior officer reading a sea state and concluding that the plan was wrong. The 4 tanks he landed helped suppress a position that was killing men in the eastern sector, where the plan's tanks were on the seabed. These are not the decorations on a triumph. They are the structural elements of a survival. The 80th anniversary commemorations of June 6, 1944, took place in 2024, and for the first time in the operation's history, there were no surviving D-Day veterans whose living testimony could supplement or contradict the archive. The last of them, men who were 19 and 20 years old on the beach or in the water or in the air over Normandy, have gone beyond the reach of oral history. What remains is what has always remained in historical research, but which now carries an additional weight: the paper, the signals, the photographs, the engineering surveys, the interrogation transcripts, the crumpled draft of a statement that was never read. The archive is the witness now. Everything we can know about what actually happened on June 6, 1944, is in those documents. And what those documents show, read carefully and without the forward knowledge that we bring to them, is a morning of accumulated failure that came within hours of being irreversible. The fingerprint on the upper right corner of Eisenhower's failure note has never been identified. It is probably Butcher's, the aide who retrieved the note from the wastepaper basket and understood immediately that it needed to be preserved. But possibly it's Eisenhower's own print, from the moment of crumpling, or from some later moment when he took the paper out and looked at it one more time before throwing it away. The note has the fold crease down the center from the crumple. It has the misdated month at the top, July, where June should be. It has the ink of a man writing in controlled, careful cursive under conditions that were bending his calendar sense. It has, if you look at the original rather than the reproductions, a slight roughness at the upper right corner from whatever handling it went through between the wastepaper basket and the Abilene archive. The fingerprint, the fold, the date that's wrong. These are not dramatic things. They are what the archive is left of the most important night of the 20th century's most important military operation. A piece of paper that was supposed to be thrown away, telling a story that was supposed to stay in a pocket. Chapter 17. What D-Day means now. There is a particular kind of silence in an archive. It's not the silence of emptiness. It's the silence of things that stopped making noise a long time ago and have been waiting since then for someone to come and listen. The boxes in the National Archives, the folders in the Eisenhower Library, the digitized scans of war diaries at Coup, they don't announce themselves. They don't compete for attention. They sit in their acid-free folders in their climate-controlled rooms, and they wait. And when you open them, what you find is not history, as it is taught or commemorated or filmed. What you find is the specific, irreducible particular, the wrong date on a general's note, the 2-mile navigational error in a Pathfinder's report, the single line in a tank battalion's after-action record about the officer who disobeyed his orders and saved 4 vehicles. These particulars are what this documentary has been built from, and in this final chapter, I want to examine not just what they mean about June 6, 1944, but what they mean now, in 2026, when the last living witnesses are gone and the archive is all that's left. The process by which D-Day was transformed from a contingent, nearly failed military operation into a myth of democratic inevitability began almost immediately after the operation succeeded. The first newsreel footage, the first press dispatches, the first radio broadcasts describing the landings. These were shaped by operational security requirements, by the emotional needs of populations that had been at war for years, and by the natural human tendency to retrospectively impose clarity on events that were, as they were happening, profoundly unclear. The men who had been on Omaha Beach that morning knew that the bombers had missed, that the tanks had sunk, that the intelligence picture had been wrong, and that they had survived by doing things the plan hadn't included. But the story that moved out over the wire services on June 6th and 7th was a story of Allied power and Allied purpose and Allied success, because that was the story the moment required, and the story that the censors could allow. The myth began accumulating its layers before the bodies were off the beach. The first generation of serious historical work, Ryan, Ambrose, Keegan, operated in the context of that myth, and, in varying degrees, worked both with and against it. Ryan's The Longest Day was an act of immense historical empathy. He collected testimony from hundreds of participants on all sides and assembled it into a narrative that restored the human scale to an event that official history had bureaucratized. His book is still the place to start for anyone who wants to understand what June 6, 1944, felt like for the men who were in it. What it is less equipped to do is analyze why the operation nearly failed, because Ryan was writing in the late 1950s from sources that were still heavily restricted, and from interviews conducted with participants whose relationship to the event was colored by 20 years of the myth's accumulation. His book is essential. It is also, in specific technical and analytical respects, superseded by what subsequent declassification and scholarship made possible. Stephen Ambrose's D-Day, published in 1994 on the 50th anniversary, brought the operation story to its widest popular audience, and did so with narrative gifts that are genuinely rare in serious historical writing. Ambrose could construct a scene, pace a chapter, and make a reader feel the weight of a single soldier's experience with a skill that most academic historians cannot approach. His work performed an important cultural service. It kept D-Day's human dimension alive for a generation that had no living connection to the event. Its analytical limitations have been documented by subsequent historians. Errors of specific detail, a tendency to present the American perspective as the central one in a multinational operation, a frame that emphasizes individual heroism in ways that sometimes obscure the systemic failures that made individual heroism necessary. These limitations don't erase the book's achievement. They place it in its proper context as a narrative document rather than an analytical one. The analytical tradition that runs from Harrison's official history through Van Creveld's logistics study, through Adrian Lewis's critical assessment of the Omaha fire plan, to the Oxford wave modeling of the Mulberry failure, represents, to me, the kind of historical work that the primary sources actually demand. It is less comfortable than the heroic narrative. It requires the reader to hold the knowledge of eventual success alongside a clear-eyed assessment of how many specific things went wrong, and how close the operation came to an outcome that the heroic narrative would have been unable to construct around. It is, in the language of the archive, the difference between reading Eisenhower's victory speech and reading the misdated note in his left pocket. Both documents exist. The victory speech is the one that gets read at commemorations. The note is the one that tells you what was actually happening. What the arc of D-Day historiography from 1944 to 2026 represents, in aggregate, is the slow and incomplete but genuine process by which the myth that an event requires for its immediate commemoration gradually yields to the record that the archive has preserved. The myth was necessary. An Allied world in the summer of 1944 needed to believe that democratic power was coherent and purposeful, and capable of the kind of organized, effective action that the Axis powers claimed only authoritarian systems could achieve. The story of D-Day as triumph, carefully planned, bravely executed, destined to succeed, served that psychological and political need. It still serves it in some contexts. But the record that Stagg's meteorological notes and Rockwell's after-action report and Morgan's understated memoir and the ultra-silence over the 350 seconds march contain is more useful than the myth in the long run, precisely because it shows the operation's survival as contingent rather than inevitable. The contingency is the lesson, not the heroism, which was real, but which is not a replicable operational input. You cannot plan for extraordinary individual courage because you cannot guarantee it or schedule it. The contingency is the lesson because it shows exactly where the plan's assumptions diverged from reality. exactly which single decisions made by specific individuals at specific moments redirected the operation's trajectory from the path toward failure to the path toward survival, and exactly what the margin between those two paths actually measured. 4 inches of oak table support, 30 seconds in a corridor, one LCT commander reading a sea state correctly, a meteorologist writing "marginal" in his briefing notes, and then walking into the room and saying there was a window, a general reaching into a wastepaper basket for a piece of crumpled paper that history needed and its author was trying to discard. In 2026, the operational questions that D-Day raises are not abstract. Militaries planning for potential large-scale joint operations in contested environments, the South China Sea, the Baltic approaches, the Taiwan Strait scenarios that defense analysts discuss with increasing frequency, are studying the Normandy landings not as historical pageant, but as operational case study. The specific failure modes that this documentary has examined are directly ancestral to the challenges those planners face. The navigation technology that works until the formation breaks up in cloud, and then doesn't. The fire support system that performs at specification in clear conditions, and fails when the conditions change. The intelligence architecture that sees everything transmitted and nothing silent. The command chain with a single authorization node that becomes the operation's most vulnerable point in a crisis. The logistics margin so thin that a storm or a port denial can cut it to the bone. These are not solved problems. They are recurring problems, dressed in different technical clothes, appearing in every serious study of complex joint military operations from 1944 to the present. The modern defense literature's engagement with D-Day is not sentimental. It is analytical and often critical in ways that the commemorative tradition is not. The debate over GPS jamming resilience in contested environments reaches back explicitly to the Eureka and Rebecca failure over the Channel Islands in the small hours of June 6th. The argument about whether strategic aircraft should be used in close support roles rehearses the Norden bombsight failure at 20,000 feet in cloud. The doctrine of mission command, giving subordinate commanders authority to act within a commander's intent without awaiting specific authorization, is a direct institutional response to the German command paralysis that left the Panzer Reserves frozen behind a sleeping dictator's authorization requirement. The Mulberry wave-focusing failure is in the site selection criteria for every modern expeditionary port construction program. The 352nd Infantry Division's undetected march is in the intelligence gap analysis doctrine that tells analysts to map what their systems cannot see as rigorously as what they can. The lessons are not filed under history. They are filed under current doctrine. What I take away from this documentary, from all 17 chapters, from the after-action reports and the meteorological logs, and the tank battalion records, and the intelligence summaries, and the crumpled yellow note in Abilene, is something that sounds deceptively simple, but becomes more complex the longer you sit with it. D-Day succeeded not because the plan was good, though parts of it were, and not because the men were extraordinary, though some of them were. It succeeded because enough people, at enough levels, refused to accept the plan's failure as their own failure. Stagg refused to let Eisenhower believe the weather was better than it was. Rockwell refused to let the plan's requirement override the sea state in front of him. The destroyer captains refused to let standing protocols prevent them from bringing their guns close enough to be useful. The sergeants on the Omaha Bluffs refused to stay on the beach and die where the plan had put them, and found instead the draws that the planning files had mapped in 1943 and then forgotten to use. Garbo refused to let his German handlers believe what their own evidence was starting to tell them. Each of these refusals was small in the context of an operation involving 150,000 men and 5,000 ships. Each of them was structurally essential. The 80th anniversary commemorations in 2024 marked the last time that living veterans stood on the Normandy beaches. The men who were 20 years old at Dog Green, or in a C-47 over the Cotentin, or on the bridge of a destroyer coming inshore at 800 yards, were in their late 90s, and most of them are gone now. What they knew that the archive preserves only imperfectly, the specific feeling of a sea state at 0635, the sound of a Eureka beacon activating in a field where no aircraft would ever come, the weight of 60 to 90 pounds of equipment in chest-deep water, is beyond recovery. The archive has the numbers. It doesn't have the weight. It has the after-action reports. It doesn't have the smell of a landing craft in the channel at night, or the particular quality of silence that settled on Southwick House after the transports disappeared into the dark. What the archive does have, and what this documentary has tried to draw from it with honest, unsmoothed attention, is the record of a morning when everything that could go wrong went wrong, and when the margin between catastrophe and survival was measured in the specific decisions of specific people, whose names are mostly in footnotes rather than headlines. Dean Rockwell, who beached his LCTs directly and saved 4 tanks and doesn't appear in the commendation records. The 1056th Port Construction and Repair Group, who worked 35 days in a demolished harbor and don't appear in the anniversary programs. Frederick Morgan, who designed the house that others renovated, and whose memoir sits unread in the bibliography, while the generals who came after him fill the shelves. Garbo, who invented 27 fictional people and grieved their fictional deaths and held the Panzer reserves north of the Seine with a cable that was, in strict terms, a lie. James Stagg, who wrote Marginal in his notes and said it out loud in a room full of generals and was right in the only way that mattered. Not certainly right, but less wrong than the alternatives. The 5th of June, 1944, late evening. A man sits alone with a yellow legal pad and writes the words that he hopes will never be read. He misdates them. He folds the paper. He puts it somewhere. Pocket, desk drawer, somewhere accessible. Someone that acknowledges without admitting that he might need it. The next morning, the first reports come in. The beach is not clear. The casualties are not countable yet. The tanks are on the seabed. The bombers missed. The paratroopers are scattered across 500 square kilometers of Norman countryside. The plan is failing in almost every specific dimension that plans can fail. And somewhere on the bluffs above Omaha, in the draws that the reconnaissance photographs identified in 1943 and the planning documents filed and forgot, men who had no orders and no armor and no effective fire support are moving forward anyway, finding the ground that the plan had mapped and then abandoned, climbing toward a position that the plan said they couldn't reach. By 0950 hours, there's a 4-word message on a flagship's radio: "Troops on the heights." The general reads it. He puts away the contingency briefing. He doesn't take the note from wherever he has it. He doesn't need it yet. Later, he will crumple it and throw it away. Later still, someone will retrieve it. And later still, much later, in a climate-controlled reading room in Abilene, Kansas, in 2026, with the last witnesses gone and the archive doing the talking, someone will look at it and read the wrong date at the top and understand what it costs to write. D.